Brill is one of the most iconic locations in World of Warcraft, and its tavern is legendary among the community. Amidst the haunted woods of Tirisfal Glades is this one spot, this one refuge that gives off a cozy quality to it, almost as if the Forsaken still hold on to this small piece of humanity that they once carried. And yet, even within the warmth of Brill's Inn, there is still the overbearing chill of death, especially as you encounter the quests that can be found here. In one example, Gretchen Deadmar tells you of how cold death is for her, and before long, the mindless state will soon be upon her due to the influence of the plague of undeath, and so she wants you to help her create a simple blanket so that she can wrap the dead in its linens, a final act of service to the Dark Lady before she falls into insanity. This is not the story that we're covering today in this video, but it does reveal to us an important piece of lore that will be useful for us to understand later on. The fact that the Forsaken ultimately fall into what's called the mindless state due to the undeath decaying away every last remnant of their sanity. Regrettably, this is actually a piece of lore that Blizzard seems to have forgotten since they initially wrote it into the story back during Classic WoW. And I find this particular reveal about the Forsaken and their undeath to be very chilling, because it gives us a new perspective on many of those mindless undead that we're killing amongst Tirisfal Glades. Some, sure, they're members of the Scourge, but there are likely many that were Forsaken, just like you, that simply faded away into a mindless nothingness, now roaming the woods without thought or purpose. Before they fall to madness, Forsaken apothecaries recruit you to help create a new plague of undeath so that the Forsaken might inflict the living with the same curse that they suffer. Scarlet Crusaders must be dealt with, who see the Forsaken as mindless undead despite their attempts to rebuild some of what was once their kingdom of Lordaeron. Strange gnolls can be found stealing bodies from graves, which we talked about in my previous video on Classic WoW's Best Forgotten Villain. And then amongst all these tasks and all these things that you have to do as a player, there's Coleman Farthing, a mysterious NPC that sits quietly in Brill's Tavern, waiting for would-be adventurers to hear his tragic story.
The Agamand family was the most prosperous family in Tirisfal Glades. I used to work their mills. Before the plague, the Agamands fortified their home and convinced those in their employ to remain and help them defend. We were fools, but at least we were loyal fools. The Agamands in their pride doomed us to undeath. Now, they are minions of the Scourge. Serve the Forsaken by defeating the Agamands who fell to the plague. Serve me by bringing me their remains.
The Agamand Mills area, located in the north of Tirisfal Glades, has always been one of my favorite locations in World of Warcraft for many reasons. It was here that I made my first friend in the game, but it was also in this haunted corner of the woods that I first got my sense of World of Warcraft's world. Before I even arrived and emerged from that crypt in Deathnell, there apparently had been this battle that had occurred in the north of Tirisfal, where a family, determined to hold fast to their home, chose to defend themselves against the Scourge rather than flee from the oncoming undead. And although this perhaps seems like foolishness, especially with how they recruited their servants and workers to fight against really impossible odds, there's actually a lot more depth to this story than one might realize at first glance. Now, Coleman Farthing, he clearly has no love for the Agamands, and he tasks you with killing every member of the family that he knew in his life who were raised into undeath. Gregor, Nissa, and Thurman. Clearly, the battle for Agamand Mills didn't go so well, and none apparently survived what happened all those years ago up in the north of the zone. And as you're about to leave to venture to these haunted lands, Coleman stops you a second time for another quest. And in this one, you're told about a specific member of the Agamand family, Devlin Agamand.
He was the younger of the two sons in the Agamand family, and in life the two could not have been more different. Thurman was tall and gentle, while his younger brother was weak and sharp-tongued. When Agamand Mills fell to the plague, I was not surprised to hear that Devlin was quick to succumb. His mad chattering can still be heard near the road leading to the Agamand Mills. I'm collecting the remains of the Agamands, and I want poor Devlin. Find him, destroy him, and bring me his bones.
Now, clearly Coleman has a particular vendetta against this specific member of the family, but we're not told the reason as to why, other than apparently Devlin was kind of annoying in life compared to his brother. And is that really a good reason for Coleman to hate him with such a passion? Well, maybe there's more to this story than what Coleman is telling us. So let's get our supplies and head to the Agamand Mills and see where the road takes us. Now, when you first arrive at the Agamand Mills, it will probably take your breath away at just how many Scourge are present in this small area. The windmills are crawling with skeletal mages, soldiers, as well as other reanimated undead servants, who we will be discussing here soon. It's amongst all these horrors, though, that your search begins for the members of the Agamand family, and it's likely, due to his location near the south of the mills, that the first one that you will find is Devlin. You discover that he has this unique skeletal mage model compared to the other skeleton mages in the area, and upon attacking him, he will taunt you with lines like, "Join the Scourge," and "Came to visit the family, die, fool." Maybe it's just the fact that he's a member of the Scourge, but Devlin seems to be very pro-Scourge. Anyway, he isn't a very difficult fight, so you'll make quick work of the youngest Agamand, and his last words, admittingly, can be quite haunting. He says, "Mother, oh mother, you should have listened to me." Even in his undeath, clearly Devlin had some remnant of his humanity that remained that made him think of his mother during his final moments. But we can't delay. We're still surrounded by many enemies, and there's other members of this mysterious family to kill. But why does Devlin have this really cool, unique skeletal mage model? Why is he yelling at us to join the Scourge and seemingly mocking his own family? Well, we don't really know, but perhaps moments after slaying Devlin, you might find something curious, assuming that you're a little lucky. Killing any of the skeletal mages in the Agamand Mills has a chance to drop an unsent letter from Thurman Agamand, the older brother of Devlin. And in this letter, we learn quite a lot about what happened here at the Agamand Mills, a lot of what Coleman did not tell us. Honestly, I was tempted to just give you all a quick overview of what this letter says, but considering that many watching this probably have never read Thurman's letter, I figured I'll just read it in its entirety. It's not that long.
Dearest Yvette, I will entrust this letter to our fastest runner. I pray he can find a way through the forces surrounding us. I pray you read these words, for they are the last you will hear of me. My only comfort in these dark days is the relief I feel, knowing that you are free of my fate. I fear my father made a grave error when he decided to remain and defend our home. The forces of the Scourge rage through Tirisfal Glades, and although we are well fortified and well stocked, after the betrayal of my brother Devlin, we lack the strength and numbers to withstand their continued assault. If you receive this letter, Yvette, then know that Devlin is a traitor. Devlin despaired and sought an escape from our ill fortunes, and in doing so, he made a pact with the Scourge. I do not know what price was promised him for his betrayal, but I'm sure it was laced with lies. If you see my brother, then flee from him. He is a fiend. A few nights ago, he murdered 2 of our watchmen and led a small group of Scourge through the breach, leading them to where many more of us slept. Their ambush was brutal. They slew a third of us before we could take them down. Now, we barely have enough men to watch our borders. It's only a matter of time before our wearying guard drops and the Scourge attack. And although I saw Devlin's face amidst the desperate men and the gaunt-faced Scourge on that accursed night, he slipped away before I could catch him. He might be dead, or he might still live as an agent of the Scourge. Either way, he is a monster. Devlin warned us that if we tried to face the Scourge, then we were doomed. He told us this when they first entered Tirisfal Glades, well before they encircled our home. Perhaps he was pleading with us to leave.
Perhaps he was gloating. It was always hard to understand Devlin's motives. Since he was a child, he was a mystery to us. But he was right. We are doomed. The Agamand family line will end. Although I still live, I know I soon will be dead. I'm not afraid, and I do not regret remaining with my family. But my last thoughts will be of you. Live on, my beloved Yvette, and I will find peace. Thurman.
There's really a lot to unpack here, everybody. First of all, the most obvious, clearly the reason why Coleman Farthing back in Brill has this vendetta against Devlin in particular is because it was Thurman's youngest brother who betrayed the Agamand family and its defenders. It was because of Devlin that Coleman suffers the fate that he does. But more than that, this letter also reveals just how kind-hearted Thurman was in his life, which is something that Coleman told us early on, and how despite knowing that Thurman was going to die, despite knowing his end was near, he found this great comfort in the idea of his love, Yvette, being able to live on happily without him. Sadly, though, we do deliver this letter to Yvette, and we realize that Thurman's hopes ultimately were for naught, for she too was killed by the Scourge, raised into undeath, and now she walks as a Forsaken. When we deliver this letter to her, she tells us that she begged Thurman to leave Agamand Mills while they were still alive, but he was too loyal to his family, and she mourns him, at least for a moment, and then tells us that holding any regrets is for weaklings, and she has no loyalty or affection any longer to those that she might have loved in her life. Her only purpose now is in service to the Forsaken and the Dark Lady. I think two things are curious about this particular interaction with Yvette. The first being that this woman is revealed to be the daughter of Coleman. So perhaps while her father was defending Agamand Mills with Thurman, Yvette was maybe hidden away elsewhere by her father for safety. Regardless, though, both her father and her shared the same fate. There was no escaping the wrath of the Scourge, it seems. But the second observation is something that is a repeated theme throughout Forsaken quests in Classic WoW. Something that many of you might not be aware of, and it's this. The Forsaken, they might remember the lives that they had before, but they don't care anything for them. Not for who they once were, not for the people they once loved, or what their former passions might have been. The Forsaken now live only for themselves, for their people, for their Dark Lady, and to afflict the world with the same ugliness that they now carry. But we're going to talk more about that later, because right now, we have to return to the mills. The rest of the Agamand family is scattered amongst the ruined windmills. Thurman is nothing more than a large zombie now. Gregor is a ghoul, and Nissa is a banshee. All of which may give you a little bit of trouble finding and killing due to all the surrounding undead mages and soldiers of the Scourge, but you will manage. Soon, the remains of all the members of the Agamand family will be in your inventory, and when you return to Coleman to present what you've gathered, this is what he says.
Revenge has a sweet taste, don't you think? When you destroyed the Agamands, did you catch any hint of free will within them? I hope so. I hope they knew fear before they were smashed into oblivion. It is a foolish hope, I know, but it is a hope that I foster nonetheless.
You know, something I always loved about this quest is that it shows us just how cruel and complex the Forsaken are. I mean, really think about it. Coleman knows that Devlin was the one that betrayed him and the Agamand family. It wasn't Thurman or Gregor or Nissa who stood beside Coleman in defense of the mills. And yet, despite this, Coleman doesn't care. He hates all of the Agamands equally simply because it was their decision to remain at their home that caused him his undeath. But what's curious is nobody forced Coleman to stay and fight with the Agamands. He even admits this. Hell, Yvette, his own daughter, she was begging Thurman and her father to leave, but neither of them listened. Coleman's death, therefore, in some ways was of his own doing. and yet he blames the Agamands for it. He even delights in the idea of this family still having some of their free will present as you slay them, because he loves the idea of terror being present in their hearts as they're killed by you. When you look at Coleman Farthing, you see somebody very three-dimensional in terms of who he is and his relationship to his own death as well as his undeath. And maybe it's tempting for us to say that he's being evil or irrational or unnecessarily cruel, but he's forsaken. He doesn't even care anymore. His heart, or what remains of it, is only in service to ridding the world of the Scourge, taking a revenge against the Lich King, and inflicting harm through the Forsaken's new plague of undeath on all the living of Azeroth, so that they too might know death and its cold like the Forsaken do. Maybe the Tauren of Mulgore are innocent, the orcs, the humans of Stormwind, the dwarves, and so on, but the Forsaken don't care. Like the Agamand family, the world is nothing more than something for them to take out their anger and anguish on. And this is one of the reasons why the Forsaken are one of my favorite races in World of Warcraft. Because whatever they were in their lives, now they're downright evil, you could argue. And it's sad that Blizzard unfortunately didn't continue this type of storytelling with the Forsaken going into later expansions. They kind of turned them more into like weary souls longing for family and reconnection. In later lore, for example, in Battle for Azeroth, you even have moments where the Forsaken attempt to reconnect with family members still living in the Alliance. Why would the Forsaken do this? Why would they care? Could you imagine Coleman Farthing doing this? I certainly can't. I mean, Coleman has you kill his daughter's former lover in life just so that he can collect his remains and put them on his mantelpiece. And his daughter, standing just a few feet away, she doesn't even care. I mean, that is the Forsaken in Classic WoW. They're kind of scary. And you know, when it comes to this story, there is one question that still remains in regards to this whole Agamand Mills quest. And that is, why did all of this happen in the first place? Why did the Agamand family care so much about defending a couple of mills? They could have just ran. They clearly had a ton of land. They probably had a ton of money. They could have taken a boat and sailed away. So what gives? Well, we've already gotten some clues as to the answer to this, but the final answer to the question is revealed in one of the follow-up quests. But it isn't revealed in the quest text, but in a visual sort of way, which is one of my favorite types of storytelling in World of Warcraft. So after helping Coleman with slaying the Agamand family, he sends you to the local magistrate of Brill, who tells you that he wants you to return to the mills and slaughter a powerful necromantic skeleton of the Scourge called Captain Dargle. Now we're told that this captain has been raising the ancestors of the Agamands as undead, and he's slowly establishing the mills as a military foothold for the Scourge. And obviously, this cannot be allowed. And as we're doing this quest, making our way through those haunted mills yet again to that family crypt located near the rear of the property, this is when that final question gets answered for us. Because you see, Captain Dargle is protected by not just a few, but a ton of ancestral zombies and ghosts that all occupy this crypt and the surrounding area. So much so that this is the first quest that you will likely encounter as a Forsaken player that demands that you find somebody to help you, as there's just so many enemies to deal with on your own. And that multitude of enemies shows us why the Agamands stayed here on this land to defend it, despite the impossible odds stacked against them. It's because, look at all these ghosts and zombies. These are all the ancestors of the Agamands, going back generation upon generation upon generation. Husbands, wives, sons, daughters. The Agamands, we have been told at several points in their story that they were a people that loved their family, They were even willing to die for it. Yvette, she pleaded with Thurman to run away from the mills before the Scourge arrived, but he couldn't abandon his little brother Devlin, his mother or his father, and the family as a whole. They couldn't leave behind their honored dead to watch their ancestors be raised as zombies and skeletons to fight for the Scourge. Could you leave behind your dead family members to succumb to such a fate? The Agamand family, although we never actually get to meet them in the sense of talk with them, clearly they demonstrate that they were a family that truly cared about one another. They truly cared about their land and those that came before them, and they were willing to lay down their very lives in defense of that family. I remember all those years ago doing this quest for the first time back in 2005, and what a contrast this quest suddenly revealed to me. On one hand, you have this family tragically betrayed by the youngest sibling who maybe, just maybe, might have been able to hold out against the Scourge had that not happened. But they died, surrounded by one another, and were raised into undeath together, as well as their grandparents and their parents and others, all of their ancestors in their family crypt. And despite this tragedy that happened to these people, Coleman and Yvette Farthing and the Forsaken in Brill, they don't care. They don't care about these people and who they were in life and what they believed in and what they stood for. The Forsaken only are concerned with the destruction of the Scourge. The Agamands, they are mere foes to be slaughtered by the Forsaken war machine in service to the Dark Lady. I mentioned at the beginning of this video the quest that revealed to us the lore that Forsaken ultimately fall into madness, a mindless state of being. And think about that for a moment in relationship to this quest. One day, all the Forsaken will succumb and fall into madness. But before that time comes, they will slaughter anyone who stands in their way, living, undead, or otherwise. And things like feelings for those that the Forsaken once knew in life, past loves, family, whatever, all of that is weakness that gets in the way of the Forsaken's ultimate goal. Truly, even though the Forsaken have broken free of the Lich King's control, in many ways, these people are still monsters. And that is why, at least in my opinion, this very short questline in Tirisfal Glades is one of the saddest storylines in Classic World of Warcraft, because it shows just how little humanity remains in the Forsaken, who sit quietly awaiting their revenge in those whispering halls of the Undercity. Tirisfal Glades is a zone that is absolutely packed with lore and story, both on the surface and beneath. Fans of Warcraft 3 will recognize this area as the former heart of the Kingdom of Lordaeron, the human kingdom that Arthas Menethil was once the prince of. And although in the past this land was a beacon of light and humanity's prosperity in the north, now it's just a decayed ruin of what it once was, overrun with mindless Scourge, zealot Scarlet Crusaders, and the recently freed Forsaken trying to rebuild some semblance of what their lives used to be in their decayed homeland. The zone is horribly grim and depressing, whose quests have you not only taking out anger upon the Scourge that brought ruin to the kingdom, but also upon the Scarlet Crusade, who just see the Forsaken as monsters, despite the fact that they've regained their free wills and ability to think for themselves. Frequently, you're going to find quests that embody how cold the Forsaken have become in their undeath, where they throw aside trinkets of former loved ones, they share no empathy towards their prisoners, and they even show that they have no loyalty towards their fellow Horde faction members. The Forsaken care for nothing and nobody except themselves, as they too see themselves as cursed and forsaken by the holy light. Now, worshipping the cult of the Forgotten Shadow in the ruins of Lordaeron's former capital city, the Forsaken silently await their day when they can unleash their pain upon the whole of Azeroth who has judged them so cruelly. And it's among these quests that you'll find one storyline in particular that, admittingly, many people skip due to its requirement of long runs all throughout Tirisfal Glades, that being the Prodigal Lich storyline of Brightwater Lake, a story that could have changed the entire World of Warcraft as we know it had Blizzard continued it in later expansions. The questline begins in the town of Brill, where players will encounter the magistrate Severin, who instructs them to venture to the Undercity to seek out Bethor Iceshard in the Magic Quarter. Bethor is a high-ranking and very powerful mage, the player is told, who is seeking assistance, an agent to assist him with fighting against the Scourge. Now, we're not told much as to exactly what Bethor wants us to do, but the quest does drop an immediate major hint that would leave any Warcraft 3 fan back in 2004 eager to figure out what happens next. This is what you are told.
Present these orders to Bethor. He will instruct you on your mission. I don't know its details, but it deals with recruiting a wayward Lich, and it will be dangerous. So ready yourself. You must not fail.
Now, for those that don't know, a Lich is an incredibly powerful necromancer, or leader most of the time within the Scourge, blessed with eternal life by the Lich King himself, as well as this horrifying, hovering skeletal form. The most famous Lich is, of course, Kel'Thuzad, who players interacted with extensively back in Warcraft 3. So the idea that there's a wayward Lich who the Forsaken want to recruit into their ranks, like, that idea sounds not only epic, but it certainly sounds very dangerous as well. It's a great beginning to an awesome questline. After a bit of running and reaching the Magic Quarter in the Undercity, the players will meet Bethor Iceshard, who is quick to give us a rundown of what exactly he is looking for us to do. We are told that there is an island in the middle of Brightwater Lake in Tirisfal Glades, and located on that island is a Lich who has taken up residence. Curiously though, Bethor tells us that this Lich is not a skeletal horror like Kel'Thuzad or other Liches from Warcraft 3, but a Forsaken of free will. However, this Lich believes that all other undead that he encounters or has encountered, including the Forsaken, he sees them as Scourge slaves, so he attacks anybody who approaches him. The player is also told that this Lich is specifically desired by the Banshee Queen due to his immense knowledge of necromancy, but before he can be recruited, his identity in his life and his talents need to be fully understood first by Bethor and the mages of the Magic Quarter. Therefore, you are told to sneak into his camp on his little island, steal his spellbook, and return it to Bethor so that he can study it. I always found this phase of the quest to be so fascinating because it reveals to us two things about the mysterious Lich that we are about to encounter. The first is that apparently a Lich in the lore doesn't necessarily need to be a giant floating skeletal monster like what we've seen with Kel'Thuzad and other Liches from Warcraft 3. And second, whoever this Forsaken is, he has to be truly incredibly powerful, insanely powerful in fact, to be put on the same tier as a Lich from the Scourge, despite just being a simple Forsaken. But who is this man exactly? Well, the quest is about to continue because we have to learn more. After a very lengthy run back into Tirisfal Glades, players will find themselves at the water's edge of Brightwater Lake. The island, players quickly discover, is covered with multiple roaming undead bodyguards, all of whom will attack you on sight. And the Lich that we have heard so much about, he stands simply at the head of the zombie horde beside this small campsite that he has constructed for himself. You can't speak to him, but you are able to snag his spellbook after fighting through his guards, which means it's time for you to take yet another trip back to the Undercity, back to Bethor. You can already see why a lot of people skip this quest. It's a lot of running. But if you can tolerate the journey upon returning to the Magic Quarter, it is revealed that the so-called Lich on the island is none other than Gunther Arcanus, who Bethor knew in his life. Gunther Arcanus, Bethor explains, was a friend of his, along with Thule Ravenclaw, who players might remember from Silverpine Forest. He's the leader of the Rothhide Gnolls, but this video is not about him. The point is, the three of them were members of the Kirin Tor, and Gunther Arcanus, despite necromancy being illegal, he studied the art in secret. Now, Bethor says that knowing now that Gunther is hidden away in Tirisfal, the Forsaken must have his necromantic talents, and you, being the adventurer and his agent, are tasked with convincing him to join up under the Dark Lady's banner. So, back to Brightwater Lake you go, yet again. Now, the journey is worth it because upon returning, we learn some pretty incredible things about this seemingly insignificant NPC on this tiny island. First of all, though, it is important to mention that Bethor does put a magical spell on the Lich's spellbook to convince him of his freedom from the Lich King's control. Remember, Gunther just kind of attacks everybody on sight because he thinks he's the only undead with free will. And even though Gunther does see this spell and hear Bethor's message, he isn't really fully convinced yet. He needs a little bit more. So he tells you to prove that you too are no longer bound by the Lich King's control by summoning a very powerful Scourge agent, Lilith Nefara, and to slay her. You use a candle nearby, a special table that's found on the Lich's island, and after a pretty dangerous fight, you're able to go back to Gunther and demonstrate that yes, you too have free will, and now, truly, he is convinced. And it's at this stage of the quest chain that we start learning a little bit more about this NPC. Specifically, we learn that Gunther was so powerful as a necromancer in his life that even after being raised as an undead by the Lich King, he was able to break free of Arthas's control completely on his own. This revelation is incredible because, to my knowledge, Gunther is the only person in all of Azeroth that we know of that was able to accomplish something like this. Clearly, this Lich, this Gunther Arcanus, must be incredibly powerful that he can challenge the domination of the Lich King. He gives you a communication shard. We return to Bethor to deliver it, allowing the two friends to communicate, and they reunite after all this time apart. And with that, the questline ends with Gunther agreeing to join the Forsaken to teach the undead of the Undercity necromancy. But here's the curious thing though. This story, this NPC, Gunther Arcanus, we never hear another word about him in World of Warcraft. Even later on in Classic WoW, we do encounter a really long quest chain where we fight against Thule Ravenclaw on Fenris Isle. And even though this quest chain involves Bethor Iceshard, there's never again a mention of Gunther Arcanus in the game, even after 20 years of expansions and story development. The main reason why I wanted to make this video is because I don't think there is any other NPC in World of Warcraft that has been established as being so powerful, so influential, and yet was so easily forgotten by Blizzard in their writing room. A necromancer in life that was so skilled that he could break the domination of the Lich King by his own willpower with no assistance at all, long before the Lich King began to lose some of his power due to Illidan's meddlings in Warcraft 3. That is an insane degree of magical power, mastery, and will that this character possesses, and the fact that he's recruited to the Forsaken specifically to bring the skill of necromancy into the Horde, that's a huge thing too. So my guess when it comes to this questline and this NPC is that Gunther exists primarily to bring the Necromancer class into World of Warcraft at some point in the future. For those that don't know, the Necromancer actually was one of the original classes planned for Classic World of Warcraft, but it was scrapped due to a lack of time. And it's quite possible that Blizzard had it planned that down the road, the Necromancer would be added to the game, and maybe quite possibly it was going to be a unique class to the Horde, kind of like the Shaman or the Paladin on the Alliance. And the reason why I say that is there's no NPC on the Alliance side of Classic WoW's storyline that seems to exist to teach the Alliance necromancy, so maybe necromancer was going to be a horde specific class at some point in the future. However, I think that as WoW's storyline progressed and more was written out, and of course with the decision to make Death Knight World of Warcraft's first new class edition, the plan maybe changed. The Necromancer was scrapped in favor of the Death Knight. Down the road, Warlocks started getting a little bit more summoning abilities. I mean, it's not really the Necromancer experience, but whatever. The Forsaken lore issue of dwindling population numbers, that was solved by the Valkyr rather than by Gunther Arcanus and his teachings of necromancy to the Forsaken. Blizzard sort of came up with alternative story ideas and just put Gunther Arcanus on a shelf to collect dust, seemingly forgotten by most players, but never forgotten by me, because when I started playing this game back in 2005 and I made my first Forsaken character, this NPC in particular was one of the most fascinating NPCs, characters, stories that I encountered in the game. And all these years later, I've been waiting to see what Blizzard is going to do with Gunther Arcanus, with a character of this degree of importance and power. But of course, over all these years, I've been rather disappointed, I confess, and maybe by making this video, and maybe you guys sharing it, leaving comments, and maybe even a like, maybe we can remind Blizzard of this forgotten NPC and continue his storyline one day in the future with a future World of Warcraft expansion. Because at least in my opinion, a character like Gunther Arcanus should not be forgotten. And there's a lot of potential for this character to not only change the lore of the game forward, maybe bringing that Necromancer class into World of Warcraft, but maybe even changing the gameplay as well, because having a full-on summoner class in the game would be pretty wild, wrestling with a bunch of undead skeletons and mages and abominations and all sorts of things. It would be really cool. So today, the current tone of the Forsaken, at least in my experience, would be this. The Forsaken, they are victims of bad luck, but they still are trying to retain a little bit of their humanity and survive in a world that does not understand them. Originally, the Forsaken were led by the Banshee Sylvanas Windrunner, but after her betrayal during the events of Shadowlands and at the end of Battle for Azeroth, the Forsaken were left leaderless for a time until they assembled their own new council, and lo and behold, the sister of Arthas Menethil is also back to help guide them into a hopefully brighter future. Their home, the Undercity, has been destroyed, and so they lean very heavily on their allies in the Horde in order to survive. And in doing so, maybe in some ways they have gained a respect for their allies. We also have seen events in the lore that have involved the Forsaken, like the Arathi Highlands Summit, where they were given the opportunity to reconvene former loved ones under a banner of truce before everything all went sour. The point is, today, the Forsaken tend to have a vibe of a group of people that were forced into undeath against their will, and yet still they are retaining some of their humanity and some of their dignity, and they are trying to do their best to survive alongside their allies, the Horde. Now, let's talk about the Forsaken in Classic WoW, because you have a completely different people with a completely different attitude. First and foremost, the introduction cinematic if you make a Forsaken character. Pay attention to the dialogue, because right in the beginning, the narrator will tell you if you make a Forsaken that you have no true allegiance to the Horde. You do not care about them at all, and you instead are seeking the goals of the Forsaken and the Dark Lady of the Undercity. The orcs, the trolls, the Tauren, they mean nothing. Because secretly in the Undercity, you will soon discover as you begin questing through Tirisfal Glades, you will find that the Forsaken are creating a new plague of undeath. A new plague that is going to turn all of the living into undead, so that everybody, as I've said in previous videos, can be just as ugly as the Forsaken are.
Keep in mind, these people are the Forsaken in Classic WoW. Really focus in on that word. Why do they call themselves the Forsaken? Because after they were brought back into undeath and they regained their free will, their friends, their allies, their loved ones, they abandoned them. They threw them aside. They saw them as monsters. They saw them as abominations to nature. And so the Forsaken have this deep wrath, this deep sense of revenge that permeates all of their quest lines and interactions all through Classic WoW. It is no wonder then that the Royal Apothecary Society is trying to create this plague, because they want everybody to suffer in the way that the Forsaken have been made to suffer. We could grab a lot of quests from Classic WoW where we interact with the Forsaken, but let's just start things off with where we've traveled so far in this YouTube channel, Tirisfal Glades and Silverpine and Hillsbrad. So first of all, we haven't talked about this quest on the channel, but there is the Delilah's Ring quest chain for those of you guys that know about this one. This is a ring that you can find amongst the rotting dead in Silverpine Forest at this boat. And after a little bit of an adventure, you're able to track down the husband of the woman whose rotting body you took this ring off of. And you want to know what the husband tells you about his wife? He says bluntly that he is incapable of even feeling any sort of grief because he's an undead. The only thing that he cares about is revenge. The only thing that he can feel is hatred. And after you kill his wife's murderer, here's what he does. He doesn't keep the wedding ring that you brought to him. No, he gives it to you as a reward. He says that he chooses to keep the hands of the man who murdered his wife just for his own sick delight. In the Agamand Mills family crypt questline, you have Coleman Farthing. Coleman Farthing, he's this guy who wants you to kill off all the reanimated members of the Agamand family who were forcibly raised into service of the Scourge after being betrayed by their son, Devlin. I made a whole video about this. Now, Coleman, he knows that the Agamands were betrayed by Devlin. And he knows that they were murdered and that they were forced into undeath. And yet, despite this, Coleman doesn't care. He just wants you to go and slaughter every single member of the family so that he can collect their remains and delight in their dooms. Coleman was a farmhand of the Agamands, and honestly, their only crime, according to the quest text, is that they were just related to the guy who led to his undeath. Coleman even makes comments about how he hopes that in the last moments before you killed these family members, that they retained a little bit of their individuality, I guess is the right word for it, so that they could scream in horror and realize the suffering that you were inflicting upon them. Coleman is a really messed up guy. Now, his sister, Yvette, who also stands in Brill Tavern, at one point you can find a letter from Thurman Agamand while questing up in the mills, and you would deliver this to her. And although she would have a very brief moment of nostalgia for her time together with Thurman because they were former lovers, she just chooses to toss aside her former feelings. She calls them a weakness, and she says that the only thing that matters to her is her new life as a Forsaken and her goals. Her past loves, her past friends, her past life, it means nothing. There is another quest that can be found on the other side of the world in Thunder Bluff, and it is given to you by a Forsaken by the name of Clarice Foster. Now, she is an undead who is absolutely filled with rage at her now dead husband, who apparently left her to go fight against the undead. And in her rage and wrath and disgust, she gives you a pendant, and she tells you, go leave it on his grave in the sepulchre all the way over in Silverpine Forest. And I want to read to you what the quest text says when you get to the sepulchre and you put this pendant on the ground. The pendant that once belonged to this woman's husband who nobly went out and fought undead and died. And as you lay it on the ground, this is what the quest text reads. The stone is cold to the touch, but has obviously been abused. Trash litters the area, nicks and gashes decorate the relief atop the coffin, and the foliage around the grave has started to grow over the site. No one cares for whoever is buried here, especially not any victims of the plague. You place the worthless pendant on the grave, and the gemstone within the setting seems to dull noticeably. As you stand to leave, you look down at the pendant. It lies lifelessly over the hands of the relief sculpted into the top of the coffin. Your thoughts are interrupted by a stiff, cool breeze passing over the sepulchre. For a moment, everything around you is silent. I don't know why, but that quest in particular has always stuck with me, even after 20 years of playing World of Warcraft, just because I guess this is the quest that really encapsulates the tone of the Forsaken as a people. Just that there's no love in these people anymore. There's no joy, there's no happiness, unless you count revenge and taking delight in slaughter as happiness, I suppose, but there's nothing good about the Forsaken anymore. And this is what makes them fascinating, because you could imagine all of these different Forsaken NPCs that you interact with, you could imagine them being friendly, normal individuals during their life. They had friends, they would go to parties, weddings, and so on. And yet now the only thing that they can feel is this deep animosity, this deep hatred of the world around them. You even see this in the perversion of their religion. They have completely abandoned the light and have instead begun to follow the cult of the Forgotten Shadow, worshiping the exact opposite of the light and its tenets. This makes the Forsaken, at least to me, a very fascinating people, because the true tragedy of them, at least this was my understanding playing the game all those years ago, the true tragedy of the Forsaken was, yes, the fact that they were cursed into undeath, but they were also given another curse. It is a curse that makes them experiment on their own allies in the Undercity, if you guys have ever paid attention to the Royal Apothecary Society. It's this cruelty that makes them capture their enemies, living humans that probably came from Lordaeron, that were their neighbors, their whoever, and they've captured them and put them in cages and are also experimenting on them too. Ironically, they use their magic, similar to the Lich King in some way, to break the minds of people, living people like this woman here, to be their blind and obedient slaves down in the Undercity. The Forsaken are still very Scourge-like, if you think about it, with all their alchemy and experiments and their attempts at learning necromancy, like in the whole Gunther Arcanus questline. I made a whole video about that if you want to check it out after this video. The Forsaken have this maddening urge to go out and bring great violence to the world, just like the Scourge. The Forsaken, it seems like Blizzard wrote them to be Scourge, like they are Scourge, who just happen to have their own free will, and yet in their free will, everything that they've chosen to do is almost exactly the same as what the Scourge is trying to do, but the only difference is that the Forsaken are loyal to their own and to their Dark Lady, whereas the Scourge are in forced service to the Frozen Throne. And as we've talked about already in the video, Blizzard completely pivoted away from the Forsaken and who they were written to be in Classic WoW in favor of just a broken and depressed people wishing for their old lives again and wanting the love of their former friends and life and their family, and yet they're unable to attain it because, different politics and stuff and different ways of life and whatever. And I know what people are going to say. I know that there's going to be comments down in the comments section saying that the Forsaken being this pure evil race, like, it's a good thing that Blizzard pivoted away from that. Because how could Blizzard keep writing this race that exists within the Horde that is actively seeking to destroy the Horde? And how Blizzard's decision to do the Battle of the Undercity, for example, in Wrath of the Lich King, where the Horde actually shows up to help the Forsaken, and the Forsaken gain this respect for their allies and stuff, that was good writing on their part. In my opinion, it wasn't. I think that the Forsaken having a come to Jesus moment was very out of character for them as a people. At least from what I experienced in Classic WoW all those years ago, playing as a young kid, and even today playing through these zones again and reading all the quest dialogue, I would argue that even if the Forsaken's allies did help them in their time of greatest need, I don't think the Forsaken would even care. Can they even feel thankfulness? Well, we have multiple quests telling us that the Forsaken can't really feel any sort of positive emotion. They can't even feel grief. Now, some would say that maybe if Blizzard kept things like that, it would have been very one-dimensional for them. But I would argue that that's a viewpoint just born out of a lack of creativity. The Forsaken, they could have been a necessary ally for the Horde, despite Thrall and the rest of the Horde's leadership knowing the Forsaken's intention. There could have been a civil war in the Horde against the Forsaken. The Forsaken could have been subjugated, forced to fight for the Horde as servants, a sort of mirror of their former enslavement to the Lich King. All done for the greater good, or that's what the orcs and the trolls and the Tauren and the Blood Elves would say. If you played through the stories of the other races of the Horde, you would find that Thrall had specifically put orders in place and certain individuals here and there to sabotage what the Forsaken was attempting to do. That way their goals would never come to fruition. The idea of a rabid pit bull that you know will bite you at any moment that it can, and yet you keep it around for your own protection, I think that could have made for a very interesting story. And then, perhaps, all that talk that the Forsaken constantly say of, "Our time will come." Maybe then it would finally make sense what they're talking about. Nowadays, if a Forsaken says that, what time are you talking about? Back in the day, this statement meant the Forsaken were going to throw down the Frozen Throne, shatter Frostmourne and the Helm of Domination, and unleash the Plague of Undeath on the world, with the Banshee Queen standing over it all, with her loyal Forsaken behind her. As we quest and continue our adventure here on this channel throughout the Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor, Outland and Northrend and so on, we're going to encounter a lot more quests that involve the Forsaken. And as this series of sorts that I've created here on Nixxiom, as it continues, I think you will understand more and more of what I'm talking about, of how the Forsaken have really changed since Classic WoW. But what do y'all think? Did Blizzard do a good job at changing them? Should they have kept them as the genuinely evil race in the game, plotting in the shadows, awaiting their day? I'll conclude by just saying that maybe it's just the role player in me. I admit it. But I always enjoyed the immersion of playing as a Forsaken in Classic WoW, because you're trying to rebuild your former kingdom, which is completely in ruins due to the Scourge. Your great enemy has wiped it all out. You're trying to put it back together, and you're doing it alongside allies that look down on you because of what you are, treat you like your Scourge because you kind of act just like them, and although they know that you are a sketchy group of people, they don't suspect just how murderous your intentions truly are. And that was something very special about playing a Forsaken that no other race in the game had the experience of. And so I am just a Forsaken fan all these years later, and all this talk of Hillsbrad Foothills and the wars against South Shore and eating the bodies of filthy humans and dwarves and gnomes and elves, like it has inspired a little bit of that Forsaken Lordaeron Undercity nationalism, I suppose, in my heart. Yes. And so, my dear audience, I conclude by saying, Dark Lady, watch over you. The majority of players that venture into Silverpine Forest do so after finishing Tirisfal Glades. And it's in Tirisfal Glades that several threats and stories begin to be established. The Forsaken, attempting to rebuild something of what was once their former kingdom of Lordaeron, as well as their former lives. The threat of the Scourge, the undead minions of the Lich King forever attempting to wipe out the rogue Forsaken and their leader Sylvanas Windrunner. We have the Forsaken Apothecaries attempting to create a new plague of undeath to use against their enemies, as well as their allies. And of course we have the Scarlet Crusade, and there's also a few other storylines that tend to go underneath the radar, like the Rothhide Knolls stealing bodies out of the mass graves in Tirisfal Glades, or the Agamand Mills family crypt storyline, which I recently covered in another video. Now, most of this stuff, this lore, this setting, is admittingly really familiar to any player who played Warcraft 3, because after all, Tirisfal Glades is where such a huge part of the campaign takes place, with Arthas purging his homeland. So Silverpine Forest is kind of like the new player first stepping into the greater world of Warcraft, where the lore and the story is kind of familiar, but it's mostly unknown. Silverpine Forest did have a cameo in Warcraft 3, to be fair, but it was very brief, and not really all that much happened that established it as a place separate from an area like Tirisfal. So now that we've hit level 10, level 12 on our Forsaken, this is how our story in Silverpine begins. When you enter this forest, the first quest that you will likely encounter is the one located near the small farm at the north of the zone. The quest giver, by the name of Deathstalker Erland, or Erland, however you pronounce it, is a player's first introduction to an escort quest. What you have to do is follow this NPC and protect him from the monstrous wolves that patrol around the road as he's looking for his fellow Deathstalkers, whoever the heck they are. The quest doesn't actually reveal all too much, and this is actually the first time that you'll encounter this mysterious group called the Deathstalkers. That is, unless you are a rogue player, fun fact. Because if we do play a rogue at some point in Classic WoW, we can learn through some early class quests that this group, the Deathstalkers, is an elite bodyguard unit for Lord Varamathras in the Undercity, and they are responsible for gathering intelligence for the Forsaken, as well as eliminating potential threats to their rise to power. Think of it like the Forsaken's own version of SI7. However, most of us likely are not rogues doing those class quests, so this mysterious organization is, well, it's mysterious. The best conclusion that a weary traveler might come to is that maybe the Deathstalkers are a sort of military branch that is responsible for eliminating threats in the outskirts of Forsaken territory. That's what I thought, at least, when I first was playing World of Warcraft as a teenager. Now, the reason why I highlight these particular quests is because Silverpine Forest is your first introduction to the greater World of Warcraft, as I've already discussed, and it kind of begins on a mystery for a lot of people, a mystery that is really only solved by replaying the game as a different class. And I think that's just fantastic in terms of world building and immersion. But let's continue on, because the world of the Forsaken and the conflicts that they face is about to get a whole lot bigger. After meeting Erland's fellow Deathstalkers, we assist them for a brief time before we're sent south to the Sepulchre, where the Forsaken have established for themselves a base. But a few things might happen to us while we're out on the road, a little bit of world building. Let's talk about that for a second. The first thing is you might take in the scenery of this new zone. It is a corrupted place like Tirisfal Glades, but it isn't so dark. It's more like a decaying forest rather than a fully scourged one like Tirisfal, thanks to the brighter color palette that we get to enjoy. Around this time, something else might catch your eye while in the woods, and that is every single tree in the zone has been completely shredded to pieces by claw marks. And what the heck might be causing this, you might wonder? But as you continue down the road, as you make your way towards that Forsaken stronghold in this new zone, suddenly the wolves and the bears give way to something more terrifying that you might spot among the trees. The Worgen. Savage, werewolf-like creatures who clearly bear a degree of intelligence, as they've established these small camps for themselves throughout the zone. And then, if you're really unlucky, there's the Sons of Arugal, massive elite Worgen that roam the forest, who are the death of many a player who is not fully invested and paying attention. Silverpine Forest, with just a small stroll through the woods, immediately establishes that this is not Tirisfal. The world is getting bigger and the threats are getting larger, but we have only just begun. And as another little side note, just as a little nod to those of you that will understand, around the time that Classic WoW came out, we also were enjoying the first Fable back in the day. And Silverpine Forest had a very eerie similarity to Darkwood and the Balverines that haunted that forest. That was my favorite part of Fable 1 growing up, fun fact, so seeing the Worgen and Silverpine was awesome. Eventually, though, our little stroll through the woods ends, and we arrive at the Sepulchre, which, as the name suggests, is a graveyard located in the center of the zone. And it's here that many quests and stories begin that introduce us to the greater problems plaguing Silverpine Forest. Forsaken apothecaries, they are still attempting to find ways to create a new plague of undeath to kill both the Scourge as well as the living, to make everybody as ugly as the Forsaken are. And to the east, there are the wizards of Lordaeron, who encroach upon the Forsaken's territory as well as their interests. There is Gilneas, the mysterious walled-off country to the far south, and then there's 3 major threats that you are progressively introduced to and have to deal with. The first one has actually already kind of been revealed to you through the storytelling technique of show, don't tell, which is my favorite tool of storytelling when it comes to MMOs and video games. The first threat, it relates to the fact that Silverpine Forest is entirely covered in the worgen that we were just discussing. No matter where you go, they creep and they crawl in all corners of the zone, and finally, the reason for their presence begins to be revealed as you quest more and more. You're told that there is this rogue wizard of the Kirin Tor, those mages to the east, who apparently delved into a field of study that he was never meant to, out of fear of the encroachment of the Scourge. And using twisted magic, the mage summoned horrible wolfmen from a realm no mage had touched before. And in doing so, he had prevented the advance of the Scourge on his home country, but his creations became feral, killing his own allies and countrymen. Arugal, delighting in this great power, embraced his role as the leader of this wolf cult and secured himself within Shadowfang Keep, which is located in the south of the zone, a dungeon that is, in my opinion, one of Classic WoW's best. From our first encounter with the wolves of the north, to the wolfmen that haunt the forest, to ascending the towers of Shadowfang Keep to combat their wicked master, this is storytelling done so incredibly well. The lore slowly builds. The threat is always rising. This is perfection. And what makes things even more fascinating when it comes to Arugal, Shadowfang Keep, and the Worgen is the small village of Pyrewood. Although during the day, Pyrewood appears like a little tranquil human settlement that somehow held its own against the Scourge and the Worgen of the woods, at night, the truth of this village is revealed. I remember the first time being told to go to this village after dark, and when I got there, I saw how all the citizens had become Worgen. Each and every one of them has been cursed by the magic that Archmage Arugal has unleashed into the world. And this was such a cool thing from a story perspective, because it just showed how much of a threat the Worgen really were. These weren't just random man-wolves roaming around in the woods, but they were actual werewolves, capable of turning seemingly innocent villagers into rampaging, violent monsters beneath the gaze of the moon. And it seemed to me, at least at the time, as a newbie Forsaken player with some familiarity with Night Elf lore, that the Worgen curse couldn't be hidden when the goddess Elune was high atop in the heavens. Little did I realize just how big this story really was, but that's a video for another time. I will say, though, that I would like to make an entire video dedicated to Archmage Arugal at some point and his lore, but I'm kind of unsure if that video would interest you all, since he's such a well-known story and an iconic villain. But if you do want to see that video from me, just hit the like button. Maybe if the video can hit around 2,000 likes, I'll know there really is an interest to hear this man's story, because it is, at least in my opinion, one of WoW's best. And there's often many overlooked details of his lore that other content creators have missed. I'll do my best to give his story justice. Anyway, I think what makes Silverpine such a strong zone in terms of storytelling is the rising tension that I think you guys are possibly getting the sense of. That rising threat vibe that the forest creates. What begins as facing simple undead and gathering bear hearts quickly turns into not only a struggle against a rogue sorcerer gone evil, summoning werewolves to do his bidding, but also a horde player will have his first encounter with the Kirin Tor. And for those of us who played Warcraft 3, we know that Argamand has just destroyed Lordaeron in the story, and now these mages are wandering the woods of Silverpine in the ruin of their former home. And this, my friends, is an element of Silverpine storytelling that many seem to have missed even after 20 years. And it's actually one of the main reasons why I enjoy Silverpine so much as a zone. Real fast though, I did want to give a shout out to this channel's sponsor, Zygor, who is linked down below in the description. It's World of Warcraft's Ultimate Guide add-on for Classic WoW or for the upcoming Midnight, and if you guys want to check it out, it would be much appreciated. But anyway, let's talk about Dalaran for a second. This is the second of the 3 major threats in Silverpine Forest that I mentioned before earlier in the video. Let me explain. I want you to look at this map. On the northern part of Lordaeron Lake is the ruined capital of Lordaeron, and on the southern coast is the ruined mage capital of Dalaran. And both groups, the Forsaken and the Kirin Tor, if you think about it, have the exact same goal. Both are attempting to rebuild what they once had, but now is lost. And it's in Silverpine Forest, these haunted woods, that these 2 factions meet face to face with an unwritten understanding that the player subconsciously picks up on through the questing that only one of these 2 groups will ultimately survive in the north of the Eastern Kingdoms. Either the Forsaken will wipe out the threat of Dalaran once and for all, securing Lordaeron for themselves, finishing the job that Argamand started back in Warcraft 3, or the mages of Dalaran will regain their magical mastery and retake the capital of Lordaeron, driving the Forsaken into the woods to rot away in the silence of their decay. And all that stands between these 2 factions of power is Lordaeron Lake, and of course what lies on the island in the center, but more on that later. This is the silent war that infects Silverpine Forest in Classic WoW's lore, and Archmage Arugal, the first threat, is ironically significant to both parties. The Forsaken, they desire his death to claim the strategic stronghold of Shadowfang Keep to use against any threats from the south like Gilneas, Hillsbrad, or others. And the mages of Dalaran, they seek the Archmage's end, lest his reckless use of magic bring an even greater threat or calamity unto the world. Archmage Arugal is the Forsaken's enemy. To the mages of Dalaran, he is their great shame. And both parties are fighting not only him, but each other. And this tension is so masterfully done in the storytelling of Silverpine Forest, it's why it has always been a delight to level in this zone. The Barrens might have more quests, more people might go there, it might be an easier zone to navigate, but in terms of the war in Warcraft, Silverpine Forest definitely embodies the spirit of the game's name, and I absolutely love it. As a Forsaken player, it was a very iconic moment for me the first time I cannibalized the corpse of a mage of the Kirin Tor. I felt like I was truly contributing to the rise of my own people's power, and it was the first time the phrase, "Dark Lady watch over you," and "For the Forsaken," really resonated in my spirit, or well, whatever was left of my spirit, that is. And I think now, just after that brief explanation, maybe you understand a bit more as to why Silverpine Forest is such a wonderful and unfortunately an underrated zone. Unfortunately, yes, many players skip over this zone and all of its stories, but for those of us that actually did remain in Silverpine, this was the story that we were treated to. However, my friends, I did say that there are 3 major threats in Silverpine, and I've only told you 2 so far. We talked about the threat of Archmage Arugal. We've talked about the threat of the Wizards of Dalaran, and most people would say that Shadowfang Keep and Arugal at its top is the final boss of Silverpine Forest. But what if I told you that this maddened wizard is not the only final boss of Silverpine Forest, because there is another threat lingering in this zone, a threat that is admittingly even greater than Arugal to not only the Forsaken, but the whole of the north of the Eastern Kingdoms, a threat hiding away in the center of Lordaeron Lake. This is a huge forgotten piece of classic WoW lore, and as much as I would like to give you all like a 2-minute overview of this whole storyline, it's really big. It would not do it justice. Honestly, it's one of my favorite stories in Classic WoW. There's so much show, don't tell. There's so much subtlety in it. There's so much theory crafting.
I think that you all deserve to know the entire thing. This NPC is one of my absolute favorite examples of subtle, brilliant storytelling in Classic WoW, and you might not recognize his name right away, but I can almost guarantee that you have felt his presence in-game, interacted with him second-handedly, whether you realized it or not. Despite the destruction caused by the recent scourging of Lordaeron, the Forsaken are determined to rebuild some semblance of society amidst the ruins of their former kingdom. Magistrate Severin is the overseer of Brill, and upon talking with him, one of the first quests that he offers to players is called Grave Robbers.
The mass graves, southwest of Garen's haunt to the north, were made to accommodate the impressive number of deaths Tirisfal suffered when the plague first came. The bodies in these graves have so far been spared an undeath, but the Scourge now send Rothhide gnolls to gather the corpses and use them to bolster their armies. This cannot be allowed.
The objective of this quest is pretty straightforward. Slaughter 8 Rothhide grave robbers, 5 mongrels, and also collect 8 embalming ichors, which apparently is the substance the Scourge uses to give these undead gnolls their life. And as you venture off to do this quest, everything should proceed rather ordinarily. As we're killing this gnolls, we see the sheer amount of bodies that they have been digging up and collecting to do who knows what with. Just piles upon piles of them. It's horrifying. But there's something that may occur during this particular adventure that might catch a sharp-eyed player's attention. Occasionally, some of the Rothides may cast a spell and inflict you with a spirit-reducing debuff called Curse of Thule. The spell makes your character all dark and terrifying looking, really capturing that my spirit is decayed vibe. Always thought this was really cool looking. But who is this Thule exactly? Is he the leader of the Rothhide gnolls, or is this some sort of undead-y, magic-ish sounding word that doesn't really mean anything? Well, we're not really given an answer upon returning to the magistrate. He just says, "Thanks for the job well done," and the quest chain ends there. I should also note that there's another quest that has us interact with these gnolls in this northern area of Tirisfal called Wanted Maggot Eye, but this quest too doesn't really give us any answers as to the origins of this mysterious curse. So for many players, it doesn't mean anything. They move on and the adventure for the Forsaken player would continue. They would fight against the Scarlet Crusade, more undead from the Scourge, without any mention of the gnolls stealing bodies from Tirisfal Glades ever again. However, upon entering Silverpine Forest, a few strange oddities would emerge, again for sharp-eyed players as they quest through this new area of Azeroth. An adventurous player, for example, might accidentally venture off the road near the Sepulchre and find themselves suddenly beset upon by a host of undead. And these undead, specifically the skeletal warriors, upon attacking, may inflict players with yet another mysterious curse, Touch of Ravenclaw. All these NPCs as well would be called things like Servant of Ravenclaw. And at this point in our adventure, we have never encountered anybody by the name of Ravenclaw, no Scourge agent or anything with that name leading the undead. So we kind of end up in the same position we were at with the gnolls back in Tirisfal Glades. Are these undead a part of a faction called the Ravenclaw? Are they led by a Lich named Ravenclaw? We're not really entirely sure. And what makes things even more confusing is that far down in the south of the zone, in a place called Baron's Peril, there are these undead within the cave that will inflict players with a curse called Blessing of Thule. Very similar to that Curse of Thule spell that we encountered all the way back in Tirisfal Glades with the Rothhide gnolls, but now we have undead casting this Thule magic. So clearly whoever or whatever this Thule is, it's either a form of necromantic magic that we've yet to fully uncover, or maybe there's a villain hiding in the shadows waiting to be revealed named Thule. Servants of Ravenclaw, Curses of Ravenclaw, Blessings of Thule, Curses of Thule, like who is Ravenclaw? Who's Thule? What is Ravenclaw? What is Thule? Well, in the Sepulchre, we begin to find our answers when we first interact with the High Executor Hadric, who tells us of a large Rothide base located in the north of the zone. There is an abandoned farm called the Dreadfields, and apparently the Rothide there are protected by a banshee named Nightlash, who we're tasked with slaying in order to wrestle control of the area into the Forsaken's hands. Now, this is the first interaction that a Forsaken player would have with the Rothide in some time, and I'm sure that many players, including myself, were surprised to see that this little tribe of gnolls was more widespread than what was initially thought. What seemed to be just a simple threat in Tirisfal, a bunch of undead gnolls digging up some dead bodies, actually appears to be a well-organized tribe of enemies to the Forsaken, who are clearly seen as quite valuable to the Scourge if they are protected by a powerful banshee. Well, regardless, after killing these gnolls and their banshee protector, we return to the Sepulchre victorious. The High Executor has more for us to do, however, as he has been quite disturbed by this growing presence of the Rothide in what remains of Lordaeron. We're then told to go and cleave our way through the undead in the eastern side of the zone to reach what's called the Decrepit Ferry, as there's something odd happening afoot at that dock, and the gnolls are somehow involved in it. Upon making our way to the location, we will discover a large collection of corpses ready for transport by boat, all protected by multitudes of undead. A pile of corpses that looks very similar to the bodies that we found back in Tirisfal Glades. And it's among all of these wrapped up dead bodies that we find a golden ring that the High Executor tells us must have belonged to somebody who was buried in one of the mass graves in Tirisfal Glades. And yet somehow, their body made its way all the way to Silverpine Forest. So it's at this stage of the story that we learn a surprising connection between the zones of Tirisfal and Silverpine. It's made evident to us that the Rothide gnolls, the one that we battled hours ago in our adventure, who were digging up those graves in Tirisfal and collecting the dead, clearly they have been shipping those corpses south down into Silverpine Forest, where they're being gathered at the Decrepit Ferry for transport to the haunted island of Fenris, located in the center of Lordamere Lake. The Executor immediately wants more answers, so he tasks you with going to the Fenris Isle, and he wants you to slaughter some of the Rothide gnolls that are present there. And while you're killing these gnolls, he wants you to collect their ichor for examination by the Forsaken apothecaries. It's his hope that perhaps the ichor may reveal who is behind this body transportation operation, or at least reveal a weakness in the Rothide tribe. So taking a swim east, the player then spends some time in the shadow of the dreaded Fenris Keep, gathering the necessary ichor so that this mystery might at last be solved. It should be said, for the record, that Fenris Keep was one of the strongest fortresses in Lordaeron during its prime. It was actually here that most of Lordaeron's army was housed, ready to be deployed to any corner of the kingdom if need be. Now, however, the fortress is just this haunted ruin of what it once was, occupied only by Rothide gnolls and the sickening stench of death and decay. Regardless, ever since I first came here as a kid, Fenris Isle has been one of my favorite places in World of Warcraft, and it remains so to this day. With its tight and almost claustrophobic design, the keep it really feels like a real fortress, and the fact that it's on an island makes the location feel oddly secure, safe, at least from a strategic point of view. I can see why the Kingdom of Lordaeron held this fortress with such high regard during its day, but let's get back to the quest. We collect the ichor, and upon returning to the Sepulchre, the apothecary there is able to do a couple of experiments to determine that the substance was made using both warlock and necromantic magic. However, the apothecary, he can't 100% determine who might have made this strange substance, which is why you're sent to the Undercity to present the findings to Bethor Iceshard, one of the leading mages in the Magic Quarter. Perhaps, we are told, his understanding of magic may shed some light as to who is behind the creation of this Ichor of Undeath and who ultimately is giving all of these gnolls false life. After taking a bat to the Undercity, Bethor immediately knows who is behind this strange magic with only a glance at the evidence that we have brought him. It is a man who Bethor once knew well in his life, whom he actually called one of his closest friends. And his name? Thule Ravenclaw. Apparently, according to Bethor, when the Scourge attacked Lordaeron, Thule joined up with Kel'Thuzad and the Lich King, all for the promise of power. And since then, Bethor assumed that his friend had been killed, that he's been dead for a while, but clearly not. Thule has been the one creating this mysterious Ichor, bringing gnolls to life as undead and tasking them to gather the dead of Tirisfal and bring them to the Fenris Isle, all so that he can use his necromantic magic to raise them as undead. And you're gonna have to stop him. This revelation, at least to me, is so wonderfully done in terms of its storytelling, because it really is a slow build-up to such an epic quest chain and conclusion that even to this day, I consider it to be one of my favorite pieces of MMO writing and game design. In the early levels, you're encountering enemies with a mysterious spell called Curse of Thule. You start to encounter other enemies with similar spells and curses like Blessing of Ravenclaw, and it all leads to the reveal that there's this traitor necromancer located in a fortress on a haunted island, raising undead and working against the Forsaken, even teaching some of his dark magic to his creations. This is just such an epic fantasy adventure story, and it's contained within just the first 2 zones of World of Warcraft for a new Forsaken player. And we're just getting started, because the story does not end there. Bethor, because he knew Thule in life, he's fully aware of how powerful of a warlock and necromancer this man must be. So he gives to you this special potion, one that can counter one of Thule's most powerful curses should you drink it. And you're certainly gonna need it, because Thule Ravenclaw isn't just some random NPC on Fenris Island, but an elite warlock / necromancer with his own imp pet, surrounded by undead gnoll bodyguards. And if you don't have a group helping you out, you will be dead and a part of Thule's undead army before you know it. You know, admittingly, a lot of people don't actually do a lot of Silverpine Forest when they're leveling up a Forsaken character. They just run straight to the Barrens. So Thule Ravenclaw and this whole story of what's going on Fenris Isle, many people have completely missed it. They've never had this epic boss fight with Thule Ravenclaw inside of the Fenris Keep. But assuming that all goes well, Thule Ravenclaw dies, and that is the end of the quest chain. The evil conjurer, he's been defeated on his fortress island, and the Forsaken can breathe a sigh of relief that the Rothhide threat is dealt with once and for all. But you know, there's still more to say, because the storytelling doesn't exactly end there for Thule. Now, maybe for many of you it did. You know, oh, you killed the NPC, it's over, whatever. But there's actually more to be learned about Thule Ravenclaw for those that get just a little bit more lucky. Because you see, as you kill Rothhide gnolls on Fenris Isle, there is a small chance that one of them might drop a strange item for you to collect. A talking head. The head belongs to a man named Alterac, who tells you that he was Thule's bodyguard and head servant in his life. Alterac, he had been told by Thule that he was going to be blessed in order to be spared the plague of undeath, but in reality, Thule had other plans. Alterac was blessed with unlife, so that the plague would not kill him, but then Thule proceeded to behead his bodyguard and servant and give the severed talking head to his Rothhide gnolls to be a plaything. And you just so happen to be the one to free Alterac from this terrible fate. Now, this is a rather short chain, but you help Alterac find his body just before he tells you about a hidden niche of treasures located inside of the fortress that contains an item that Thule very much valued in his life. You go into the fortress, and once inside, you discover a curious wand that you are told to take to Bethor Iceshard back in the Undercity, as Alaric says that he was one of Thul's closest friends. Also, according to Alaric, he shares a story of Thul and Bethor and a third friend creating this wand as a symbol of their friendship. And even after Thul's betrayal, Thul kept this item as he just couldn't part with it, but he also couldn't let the others have it. Thul simply stole it and hid it away in Fenris Keep, never to be seen again. Alaric, he tells you to leave him in the keep, where he, story-wise, still rests to this day, unable to move or die, and you return to the Undercity once more to deliver this wand to Bethor, who is shocked to discover that this token of their friendship still exists. You're given a reward, and that's it. This quest chain, this secondary one, although it's very short, it actually reveals a lot about Thul Ravenclaw if you read between the lines, especially when you combine this new knowledge with the visual storytelling of Fenris Keep and everything that you've seen so far. Think about it like this. Thul, he apparently was good friends with Bethor Iceshard and this other powerful wizard in life, even making a magical wand as a symbol of their undying friendship to one another. And yet, Thul betrays his two friends. He flees south into Silverpine Forest, and there he now haunts the Lord of Fenris Isle, with such tremendous power at his disposal in the form of the Rothhide Gnolls and all the undead that guard him. His magic and his influence can be felt all across Tirisfal Glades as well as Silverpine Forest, and yet Thul Ravenclaw is entirely alone. Have you ever noticed this? Like, he's alone on the island, surrounded by nothing but mindless gnolls and mindless undead. Even his most trusted bodyguard and servant, he killed him too, all in the name of attaining more power in the ranks of the Scourge. And so now when you see him, you see this man who is still alive. He still has his flesh. He's not an undead, but he's surrounded by nothing, just the silence of the grave and the rotting of the undead that surround him. And curiously, contrast this with Bethor Iceshard in the Undercity, his friend. Now, sure, Bethor is actually undead. He's not still alive like Thul is, but at least Bethor is surrounded by allies and friends. His people are rebuilding their civilization little by little. The Forsaken, they might be forsaken by most, but they haven't forsaken each other. And where this former friend, Thul Ravenclaw, now stands alone, surrounded by the nothingness of his power atop his keep on Fenris Isle, his former friend Bethor Iceshard, he rests in the Undercity, surrounded by allies and true purpose. We never see Thul speak at any point in the quest chain, but we learn so much about him just from his actions and his influence and the visual storytelling of his lonely fortress in the middle of a lake. And that's why he's actually one of my favorite NPCs and lesser known villains in Classic World of Warcraft, because his tale is very tragic. And that tragedy isn't exactly shoved into your face in terms of storytelling. You kind of got to read between the lines to figure it out. Let us begin in the country of Gilneas, where a young man whose name is Arugal ventures forth from his homeland, searching for magical knowledge with the mages of the nearby Dalaran. Arugal, who would later become the Lord of Shadowfang Keep, had a very humble beginning. He was a student among the Kirin Tor, and although he likely struggled early on with his academic studies, ultimately he proved himself skilled and knowledgeable enough to be granted the rank of Archmage, much to the displeasure of many, we might assume, but we'll talk about that later. Arugal, having successfully completed his studies, he looked forward to a long career as a mage, and yet his dreams were stolen away by the coming of the Plague of Undeath. What began as simple sickness, something the mages of Dalaran felt they could easily contain, the Plague of Undeath spread like wildfire across the north of Lordaeron, turning those who contracted it into undead in service to a growing host called the Scourge.
From the towers of Dalaran, Arugal watched as this undead curse grew greater and spread to the far corners of the land, and yet he did not despair, for Dalaran's magic was great and its walls were high. An outbreak of undead was no threat to the Kirin Tor nor Lordaeron as a country. Or so the Archmage believed, for when the word reached him of the death of King Taranis of Lordaeron at the hands of his beloved son Arthas Menethil, Arugal grew disturbed, and a shadow of doubt breathed into his mouth and gifted his spirit its first taste of doubt, despair, and even panic. Perhaps he began to think, seated in his high chambers, Dalaran's defenses may not be enough to hold back the tide of undeath, for if Lordaeron could fall, couldn't Dalaran too? We don't know if Arugal was present for what happened shortly after, but it's likely that he witnessed what he feared most, the destruction of his beloved city. The scholarly pride of the North Dalaran one day in the twilight of the Welkin suddenly began to rumble and shake, not from an approaching army or act of nature, but from something far more terrifying. A magic unknown to the mages of Azeroth shook the ground at the city's feet, cracked the stone of its high towers, and the city of mages began to collapse in on itself. Roofs fell onto families, schools toppled over into ruin, and the high walls that Arugal once believed unbreachable were shattered without struggle. This magic, it was not of the Scourge, but of something far darker, from a place and tongue unknown to the mages of the Kirin Tor, and perhaps it was then that a new shadow breathed into Arugal's spirit, and he conceived an idea, born out of a desire to safeguard, but one that would quickly be twisted into something far more sinister. So, whether or not Archmage Arugal was present at the destruction of Dalaran at the hands of the Burning Legion, it makes no difference. He knew of its end all the same, and he fled, taking what supplies he could carry and going west, back towards the country from whence he came. Yet he stopped just north of his homeland, and he took shelter amongst the keep of Baron Silverlane, believing it a safe place to begin his studies to unravel the issue of the oncoming Scourge. For it was only a matter of time before the plague of undeath reached the south of Silverpine Forest, Gilneas, and beyond. Arugal, perhaps driven by pride or a reckless desire to be a savior, began to try and find a way to stop the advance of the mindless undead. But the mage, he was not alone. He had contact with many surviving mages of Dalaran, and he would communicate with them often of the comings and goings of news and information across the north of the eastern kingdoms. He would ask of progress against the Scourge, of the magic that destroyed Dalaran, if what remained of the Kirin Tor had a plan of action to push back against all these threats. Yet all of his questions led to but guesswork and muted replies. There was nothing concrete, no true plan to stop the advance of the enemy, and Arugal, atop the towers of Baron Silverlane's keep, began to despair all the greater. Like Dalaran, so too would these walls be broken and these towers torn down unless he did something. It would come either by magic or by the gnashing jaws of ghouls. It was only a matter of time. Something had to be done. A solution had to be found. And it was then, at the hour of need most desperate, that Arugal found something that he had not intended to find amongst what remained of his past life. For one day, while going through a number of books recovered from the ruins of Dalaran, he picked one up and read a curious title. This particular tome of knowledge was written by none other than the mage who is known for his powerful elixirs and researching into the creation of enhanced beings. Perhaps Arugal began to wonder, this tome, this one, might contain something that could be used to fight against the Scourge. The Archmage flipped page after page, late into the evenings, seeking answers under candlelight, for the mere introduction of this book had stunned him. It was a pondering text that had written, detailing his discovery of something feral on a world afar. And this, my friends, is what Arugal read. The land of Azeroth is host to no end of wonders. Flora, fauna, cultures, and magic all teem across its surface. Indeed, the curious will find limitless variety on this world. One merely has to look. But if one looks deeply enough, then windows to entire new worlds are found. And each world is home to its own wonders, just as each world is home to its own horrors. This is the purpose of my book, to catalog those beings, those otherworldly fiends who would destroy our lands, so that explorers who happen upon them will know what they face. So if you consider yourself a guardian of Azeroth, then read on and know your enemy. Flipping further, Arugal read, "The fiend of which I write is the Worgen. Old rural folklore may hearken to these creatures, for what farmer's child has not heard the tales of beastly wolfmen stalking the fields and marshes outside of his village? And truth may hide in such tales. Perhaps they are warnings against the Worgen, veiled as myths to frighten us. But before such tales are dismissed, let me now assure the reader, Worgen are real. They may not be from our world, but avenues exist between their home and ours, and powerful magic can pull them here. Some chants are best left unuttered, for wherever the Worgen tread, they bring terror and bloodshed with them. You will know the Worgen by its resemblance to the wolves of our world. When viewing a Worgen, one can easily see its coarse hair, pointed ears, and long snout are akin to the wolves we know, but you will just as quickly see its differences. That coarse hair surrounds a powerful, two-legged body, sporting long fangs and dagger-like claws, and behind its howl lurks a malevolence possessed by no natural beast. The Worgen's home is a dark place, a place of nightmare. If that world fosters locations safe from the cursed Worgen, then my research has revealed no such bastions. And if one considers the ferocity and wickedness of the Worgen, it is likely that no such bastions exist. It is surmised that the Worgen are content to remain on their world, for although some Worgen possess powerful magic, they have made no attempt to reach Azeroth of their own accord. And for this, we are fortunate. As mentioned above, some Worgen are skilled in the mystic arts, and their magic is of darkness and corruption. Curses and supernatural poisons are common, so be forewarned. Those who face the Worgen should arm themselves with wards against shadow. It is my hope that no Dalaran wizard seeks out the Worgen, even if done in light of conscience, for no pact may be struck, no secret may be learned, no good can come from these beasts. They are best left to their world, for if found in ours and not destroyed, our peril will be dire." When Arugal read these words, he became enchanted. His mind drifted to distant planets, places that held monsters and magics far greater than anything ever seen on Azeroth before. For you see, everybody, in the original Classic WoW storyline, the Worgen were not druids of the pack, nor former night elves, but instead these savage creatures from a distant planet who waged an endless war against the Burning Legion, who were unable to conquer the Worgen and tame their savage nature. Arugal, learning this information, he likely formed a plan almost instantly. Summon these creatures to Azeroth, despite any of Ur's warnings against such meddling, and unleash them upon the Scourge and its masters. Arugal's idea, however, was not received well. His fellow mages, heeding the advice of spoke loudly against the Archmage's plan, stating that such beings as Worgen should be kept as far away from Azeroth and its conflicts as possible. But Arugal, who had grown tired of waiting and doing nothing, would not heed the wisdom of his peers or of his senior mage. In secret, he began to experiment with summoning rings and other occult practices known to few. His studies and experiments consumed him, as well as the creeping shadow that whispered to him still of the inevitability of the world's ending should he fail. But Arugal would not fail. It was perhaps one day, late into the night, while the nearby town of Pyrewood and the castle slept, that Arugal succeeded. A great howl echoed across the forest, and the mage, delighted in his success, celebrated alone with his creation. The following days, while the mages of the Kirin Tor continued their talks and debates, Arugal unleashed his Worgens upon the northlands of Silverpine. The feral beastmen, relentless and savage, sniffed out the undead haunting the silent woods and began to tear into them. The Scourge, having never encountered such monsters, were unprepared for just how violent and terrible the Worgen truly were. Before long, The bodies of many undead littered the roads, woods, and fields of the land. Arugal had succeeded where his peers had failed, and the Archmage, he was of course eager to share of his success, and he met with the Kirin Tor one day after having secured great victories with his worgen across the countryside. Now he expected to be welcomed as a hero, to receive praise and reward for having solved the Scourge crisis once and for all, but he was mistaken. His colleagues voiced their concerns, dissatisfaction, and doubt at these newly summoned monsters, as they called them, monsters. Arugal must have thought to himself, these monsters had just saved them. But his fellow mages would not be turned from their concerns, and Arugal, rather than being hailed, he was condemned and scolded for reckless use of magic against the Kirin Tor's wishes. And perhaps it was then, we might assume, that Arugal's worgen sensed the growing anger in their master, a shadow in him that was growing all the greater, similar to their own. And so, those wolves of a world afar grew restless, angry, and they rose up like a tide with their master's anger. What followed was something Archmage Arugal likely regretted, but deep down was satisfied by. The worgen, without hesitation or mercy, tore into the ranks of the mages of the Kirin Tor, slaughtering them and chasing down those who tried to escape. All the while, Arugal stood nearby and watched. He watched as the men who had doubted him were torn to pieces, how those who had wasted months of time were forever silenced between the crushing force of wolves' jaws. And the Archmage said nothing. He said nothing too when the worgen stormed the keep of Baron Silverlane, who had given Archmage Arugal refuge in the Kirin Tor's time of need. The Baron too, along with his bastard family, according to the Warcraft RPG books at least, they were all torn apart, the Baron's blood decorating nearly every hall of the keep. Even Silverlane's paladin commander, whose name was Springvale, a member of the legendary Silver Hand, he too met his end as well. His soldiers ripped apart despite their armor, despite the light that was meant to protect them. And all the while, Arugal walked in the silence of his shadows, ascending the hill towards the keep. When he entered, all that remained were the silent corpses of the former residents. The Baron, his men, servants, and guests all had found a similar end at the hands of the worgen. Arugal, upon seeing what had occurred, finally snapped. His ambition, his desire to be a savior, revealed itself as mere pride and vanity. And shame seized him then, shame and guilt. The Archmage fell to his knees, weeping into his robes until his tears mixed with the stone of Silverlane's keep, forever binding the mage to its stone walls. But Arugal was not alone in his grief and shadows. Around him were his worgen, who still looked to him as their summoner, their master. And the Archmage, with nobody left, and no spirit left to give him any joy or comfort, he reached out and proclaimed them his loyal sons. He adopted them, in a manner of speaking, you could say, into what remained of his heart. And these monsters from another world, so terrifying and fierce that even the burning legion could not conquer them, they silenced the wailing of the Archmage, and they gifted to him comfort. Years later, during the events of Classic WoW, Arugal sits atop the towers of what is now called Shadowfang Keep, watching with his loyal sons, safe forevermore in his haunted castle. A few things should be noted, however, following the events of this story. A few rather tragic details that I should mention to you all. The first being Pyrewood Village, a place I haven't spoken too much of. This village, it was spared annihilation at the hands of the Scourge, was a place of safety amongst the trees of Silverpine Forest. That is until Arugal cursed it. Now why he did this, we're not entirely sure, but one day the Archmage reached out his hand from above in the keep, and he spoke words of power over all those who called the village their home. And when the moon rose that next evening,
the citizens of Pyrewood beheld a terrible fate. For with the rising of the moon came a transformation. The people of Pyrewood found themselves to be Worgen as well. And perhaps Arugal did this to create more sons for him to adopt, or perhaps he wanted the people below to feel his grief, his loneliness, and his own curse of sorts, trapped forever atop his tower. We may never know what the Master of Wolves intended with this horrible magic, nor if he intended to spread the curse to more lands across Azeroth, Hillsbrad, Alterac, and beyond. What do you all think? Because if he had chosen to do so, would this not have made Arugal one of the most powerful beings on Azeroth, wielding an army of terror wolves from a world afar, capable of rivaling even the power of the Burning Legion? For those of us who knew Arugal's story during Classic WoW, it was a terrifying thought. And perhaps this is why it was so imperative for the Forsaken and the Kirin Tor to have him contained and then killed before his reckless magic could spread further across the world. But there is one last detail to mention, probably the most important one of all. Arugal's story may be one of sorrow and shame and guilt, but there is one last tragic detail to who he is. I sort of mentioned it near the beginning of the video. Before I reveal it though, if you have been enjoying this video, please do me a favor, hit the like button just to help with the algorithm, and if you're moved by this story, consider becoming a channel member to support future stories here on Nixxiom, to help us build an even bigger World of Warcraft lore nerd community right here on Nixxiom, and you also get rewards. And now, the more tragic detail that many people seem to have missed when it comes to this story. If your adventure back in Classic took you through Silverpine Forest, you might remember the quest chain Arugal's Folly. Started by talking with Dalar Dawnweaver in the Sepulchre, we learn more about Arugal as a mage. First, through the examination of Arugal's notes that we collect for Dalar Dawnweaver, we discover that Arugal, despite having been an Archmage, wasn't actually that magically gifted. He was kind of pathetic. He relied on workarounds and tricks to compensate for his lack of magical ability. This is why I mentioned earlier in the video that perhaps his peers in the Kirin Tor, who likely knew of his lack of talent in magical craft, were displeased at his promotion to Archmage. But it's then, as we investigate further, that we learn something else. We discover that Arugal, after having summoned the Worgen into Azeroth, what he did is he used enchanted shackles to subdue them, to make the Worgen serve him as their master. Dalar Dawnweaver says that such enchantments are a reinforcement for weak magic, which implies something rather disturbing. The Worgen who surrounded Arugal during his time of greatest grief, whom he now calls his sons, likely only serve him because of the shackles that he has placed upon them. Shackles that, in Dawnweaver's opinion, are very amateur. Perhaps, my friends, it was only a matter of time before they failed. And what then? Well, likely the very Worgen that Arugal had grown to find comfort in would have unleashed themselves upon the breaking of their bindings, tearing apart and eating the very man who takes comfort in them. Arugal was a young man with dreams when he arrived at Dalaran. He hoped to be a great mage one day, yet his lack of talent, study, choosing shortcuts, and laziness made him not the Archmage he hoped to be, but a mockery of one. Arugal hoped that it would be his hand that saved what remained of the Kirin Tor, to perhaps be finally recognized for who he truly was, and yet his actions only furthered the destruction of Dalaran's people, those who had survived the destruction of the city. Now locked away in a haunted keep, Arugal is the Forsaken's enemy when it comes to their advancement south towards Gilneas, and for the Kirin Tor, Arugal is their shame. And all of this is why the Lord of Shadowfang Keep is one of my favorite villains in Classic WoW. I would argue one of the best villains in all of World of Warcraft. When the word Lich is whispered in the night, immediately the image of a hovering, large, skeletal servant of the undead Scourge comes to mind.
a former human wizard gone evil, now a commander of undead legions wielding magic capable of freezing a beating heart within the chest. And yet, did you know that this wasn't exactly always the case? Let's quickly talk about the history of these most terrible foes, because it will be important to understand for what's coming later on in this video. Let's rewind the clock and go all the way back to Warcraft 3 and the Third War. Specifically, let us look into the Warcraft 3 game manual. Opening it, we learn of the true origin of the Lich in Warcraft's lore, how they were originally created, and this is what the manual reads. While on Draenor, Ner'zhul commanded a number of orcish warlocks and spell-wielding death knights. Yet when Kil'jaeden and the Legion captured these sorcerers after the world's destruction, they were transformed into twisted, spectral aberrations of their former selves. These newly born Liches possessed tremendous magical powers, yet their immortal undead bodies were bound to the iron will of Ner'zhul. As payment for their undying loyalty to Ner'zhul, the Lich King granted them control over the furious elements of Northrend. Now, the Liches wield frost magic along with their own considerable necromantic spells. This, everybody, is how the Lich came to be originally. A bunch of twisted orc warlocks and death knights. I should also note that the death knights that the manual is talking about here were the creations of Gul'dan during the events of the Second War, not the death knights you all might be familiar with from the Scourge that are now a playable class in the game. Maybe we'll have to make a whole video on those guys later on. But however, moving on, in the game itself, Warcraft 3 also introduced to the lore a new way to create a Lich that didn't require the direct hand of Kil'jaeden the Deceiver. You see, after Arthas killed the necromancer Kel'Thuzad, he took the elderly man's remains to the Sunwell in Silvermoon City to restore him to life. And after placing them into the pool's magical waters, Arthas called out to the power of the Lich King, and under the watchful eye of Tichondrius, the Death Knight was able to revive Kel'Thuzad as a Lich, a far more powerful being than the necromancer was before in his life. So in this instance, rather than the Lich being made by the hands of the Burning Legion and Kil'jaeden, it was created by the Lich King himself through his servant Arthas Menethil. And this is important to understand because clearly the Lich King now possessed the Legion's power to create Liches by his own terrible hands, and create them he did. During your time in Classic WoW, you can encounter a number of these enemies while questing through Azeroth. In Razorfen Downs, we battled against Amenenar the Coldbringer, Araj in Anderhall, Raz Frostwhisper in Skullomance, Balzaphon of Strathholm, and in Classic, we also went all the way to the frozen heart of Naxxramas, where Kel'Thuzad himself awaited us, ready to raise us all into the Lich King's service. And for us lore enthusiasts all the way back in the day, while fighting all of these Lich commanders of the Scourge, we sat and pondered, how many other Liches must reside in the frozen wasteland of Northrend, ready to unleash their magic upon the living of Azeroth? The thought just gave us shivers. It made the Wrath of the Lich King expansion all the more exciting. And yet, everybody, we arrive to it at last. The mystery, the oddity in the lore that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, and that is that in Classic WoW, this act of the creation of the Lich was actually expanded upon even further as the game revealed to us that there is a mysterious third way of becoming a Lich that does not require either the Lich King or the Burning Legion. And I guarantee that most WoW players, even lore enthusiasts, are not aware of this. But how is it even possible? Well, the truth is, nobody is entirely sure, except for, well, one person. And if we're going to meet him, we're going to have to take a trip to Hillsbrad Foothills. When you walk through the green and beautiful lands of Hillsbrad, it's a strong contrast to the northern lands of Lordaeron, where places like Silverpine Forest, Tirisfal Glades, and the Plague Lands are corrupted by the influence of the Scourge. Hillsbrad seems entirely untouched, spared the horrible fate of suffering the wrath of the undead, and yet hidden amongst these beautiful trees is a story that many are familiar with, but whose details are often overlooked. In Terran Mill we find ourselves, and there, amongst the various Horde NPCs, we can find one by the name of Novice Thivand. And upon speaking to him, he reveals to us a curious story. He says that some time ago, perhaps just before the events of Classic WoW or Warcraft 3, he was the apprentice of a powerful necromancer named Helcular. And his master, we are immediately told, was on the verge of transforming himself into a lich by his own means, something that his apprentice likely wanted to learn as well, given what he tells us next. Thivand says that moments before his master was to perform the ritual to transform himself, the citizens of South Shore nearby, who had learned of this man's dark magic being practiced in their land, they banded together, formed a mob, and they stormed Helcular's lair, which had recently been discovered. This band of peasants, guardsmen, and craftsmen, they all dragged the would-be lich from his lair, and Helcular watched as they threw a rope over the branch of a nearby tree, all before placing a noose around his neck. Despite whatever power this necromancer had, this lynch mob was too great and far too many, and he was hoisted up into the air by the rope until his final breath was taken away from him. After his death, Helcular was taken down from the tree at a later time, his body escorted to South Shore, where he was buried in a grave to be hopefully forgotten as a bad memory of Hillsbrad's past. But there was one who survived and one who remembered. Helcular's apprentice, who now tells you that he wishes to revive his master from the dead so that his vengeance can be rained down upon the people of South Shore. How this is going to be achieved is by traveling to Helcular's former lair, which has been overrun with yetis from the mountains, and getting a mysterious rod that the master wizard prepared in the off chance of his untimely demise. This rod would then be charged at 3 magical locations that Helcular prepared during his life, also that its power would be strong enough to bring him back from the dead. This is a short quest that we go on, and it concludes just outside of South Shore in the graveyard, where Helcular is raised from death and he attacks the nearby town with a handful of skeletons. And with him now raised, it is likely that his ritual to become a lich at last will soon resume, something that again I would wager his apprentice is quite eager to observe and to learn for himself. But wait, you might be asking yourself, how? If the Lich was this secret creation of the Burning Legion, how did random wizards gone necromancer on Azeroth learn this dark magic? Did a demon share with them the knowledge? Did some warlock come along one day and trade the knowledge for some conjured mana biscuits or something? Well, the lore in Classic WoW doesn't exactly say, but there are 2 likely theories as to how this is possible for there to be liches in Azeroth who are not affiliated with the Scourge or the Burning Legion. And let me break down both of those theories for you. So the first theory is that the Lich is not actually an original creation of the Burning Legion and Kil'jaeden. It is possible that the Lich has always been this undead, necromantic horror that has roamed various cultures and worlds, existing primarily in folklore and in nightmares. And there's always been this degree of awareness of their existence. But the Lich itself was incredibly rare, and the knowledge of how to create one, or even become one, became a closely guarded secret of the Legion upon its discovery, which of course they used in the creation of the Scourge, gifting the knowledge to their puppet, the Lich King. Now, this is a pretty good theory, and of course it does fit into modern World of Warcraft lore. However, we're talking about Classic WoW here, and this idea does kind of go against what we read all the way back in Warcraft 3's manual, and that is why there is this second theory which fits a lot better into this classic version of World of Warcraft's lore, and let me share it with you all now. So the alternative idea is that the Lich is a creation of the Burning Legion, as Warcraft 3's lore establishes, but somehow this knowledge got leaked into Azeroth. Maybe not the full knowledge of how to become a Lich though, which is why you don't have a ton of non-Scourge affiliated Liches running around, but some information regarding the ritual, some of the knowledge of Lichhood likely came into the awareness of various arcane wielders across Azeroth. The only question is how. How did this esoteric legion and scourge-only magic leak into the general population of wizards and mages in Azeroth? Well, you kind of have to do a little bit of digging in Classic WoW and Warcraft 3's game manual, and then you'll find the answer. It was the Lich King himself who likely did this. Let me explain. Before the formation of the Undead Scourge and the Cult of the Damned, it is established lore that the Lich King reached out to many powerful arcane-wielding individuals, tempting them with the opportunity to join the Scourge. The most famous person contacted, of course, was Kel'Thuzad, who became the founding member of the Lich King's Cult of the Damned. Now, when Kel'Thuzad is killed in Warcraft 3 and is later brought back to life, he claims that the Lich King now had fulfilled a promise to him. Kel'Thuzad had been granted eternal life, however, he also now had been transformed into a Lich, which almost seems to be something that Kel'Thuzad was aware of, that it was going to happen. So it's very likely that when the Lich King initially reached out to Kel'Thuzad before the events of Warcraft 3, and when he began to reveal to him his plans for the scourging of Lordaeron, the Lich King likely also told the would-be necromancer about his possibility of being granted Lichhood. And it was clearly this offer to Kel'Thuzad, the idea of being this immortal skeleton commander of uncountable undead legions, it was that temptation that ultimately drove that wizard towards joining the Scourge. And it therefore fits that when the Lich King telepathically reached out to other various arcane masters across Azeroth, he tempted them with the same offer that he gave to Kel'Thuzad: immortality and Lichhood. And to fuel their desires for immense power, it was likely the Lich King who gave to them their first tastes of hidden necromantic knowledge. Now, of course, the Lich King isn't going to tell these mages and wizards the full truth of the Scourge's esoteric rituals, like how to achieve the Lichhood that they had just been tempted with, because after all, the Lich King needs them to need him in order to get what they want. This is why the knowledge of a ritual to become a Lich would be known to someone like Helcular, even though he is not a member of the Scourge and has never been associated with them. Likely, he was a close friend of Kel'Thuzad during his life, which is heavily implied due to them being seen together in the Escape from Durnhold instance in the Caverns of Time. And he, like Kel'Thuzad, was one of the people contacted by the Lich King and given the same offer of power and immortality. However, unlike his friend, Helcular refused the offer, choosing to use the knowledge that had been revealed to him by the Lich King for his own ends, rather than serving the Frozen Throne. He became a powerful necromancer in the coming years, and he even came to understand the ritual of Lichhood to a degree that he was going to achieve the Lich form all on his own, no Lich King or Kil'jaeden required. But why refuse the offer from the Lich King? Well, self-servingness aside, let's take a little trip north into Lordaeron, because I think the lore of another Lich in Classic WoW might give to us the answer. That is Raz Frostwhisper. He is one of the bosses in Scholomance, who has a rather terrifying background on how he became a Lich. He was a hedge mage, formerly from Stromgarde, and he joined the Cult of the Damned early on for the promise of power. He advanced quickly through the ranks, and eventually Raz was given the blessing of being able to pledge his undying loyalty to the Lich King. Within Stratholme, the mage took forth a dagger and he cut open his own neck to the bone, spilling out all of his blood in honor of the Frozen Throne. And for doing this, the Lich King raised him as a Lich as a reward for his sacrifice. So clearly, becoming a Lich involves a sort of dramatic self-sacrificial ritual to the Lich King in order to earn the reward, taking Kel'Thuzad and Raz Frostwhisper as our two examples. And Helcular, I'd wager, wasn't interested in cutting open his own neck for a suit of armor trapped in some ice half a world away. Going back to Warcraft 3 for a second, according to the Necromancer unit's description, it says that before the events of the game, many powerful wizards of Dalaran were suddenly turning towards the dark arts, having been promised great power by the Lich King in exchange for their loyalty. Where once these men had been geniuses in the Kirin Tor, now they had been given mastery over the dead, as well as the ability to spread the Scourge's plague of undeath. Again, this is just confirming that the Lich King teased them with some necromantic power and what he could offer them down the road. So, putting all the pieces together, I think that every wizard that chose to become a necromancer in service to the Lich King was tempted with the same gift that Kel'Thuzad was offered, that of becoming the Immortal Lich, a true reward for their great service to the Scourge. And it fits that the Lich King would tempt many within the Kirin Tor, as weakening the magical city and its defenses would be exactly what the Burning Legion would have wanted the Lich King to do to prepare for the Legion's arrival on Azeroth. However, as fascinating as all of this is, it does raise one final point that I want to address, a kind of elephant in the room that can be quite haunting when you think about it. It's actually one of the main reasons why I made this video. That being, if Helcular was contacted by the Lich King, and he was able to refuse his offer, who else do we know that were likely in communication with the Lich King at one point? Now, of course, there's the obvious ones that we know, people that eventually became members of the Scourge, like Ras Frostwhisper himself, but what about members of the Horde and the Alliance? Gunther Arcanus in Tirisfal Glades is a necromancer that is so powerful in his art that locals believe that he is actually a lich, despite lacking the skeletal form. And where did he learn this degree of necromancy? I wonder. Thule Ravenclaw in Fenris Isle, he is a master of the Scourge's Rothhide Knolls, and both Gunther and Thule were friends with Bethor Iceshard of the Undercity during their lives. So was Bethor one of the most powerful mages among the Forsaken? Was he also in communication with the Lich King at one point? Morbant Fell of Duskwood, although there was no story directly tying him to the Scourge, isn't it possible that he was also a former wizard contacted by the Lich King and told to weaken the lands surrounding Stormwind to prepare the area for a Scourge invasion? Perhaps even Abercrombie. Yeah, Abercrombie, the Embalmer, who I want to discuss more in a future video. This character in particular is one of the most fascinating lore characters in Classic WoW, but not necessarily for how he appears on the surface. But he is a discussion for another time, but one I'm very much looking forward to sharing with you all. Lastly though, there is Archmage Malin, who gives to us a clue that perhaps his master, who resided in Stromgarde, just like Ras Frostwhisper, his master too was quite likely one of the individuals on the Lich King's contact list. And the reason being is that he sends you on a quest to retrieve the trinkets of his now deceased master. And one of those trinkets is in fact a personal phylactery that he had crafted in his life. And if Malin's master was a would-be Lich who had learned the art of crafting his own phylactery from the Lich King as a tease of greater power, does that imply that Malin himself may have been contacted too? After all, he is powerful enough as a mage to be considered an archmage in Stormwind. And why exactly is he seeking his master's trinkets and knowledge? What is he going to use it for? I wonder. Now, the reason I bring up these NPCs, both on the Horde, the Alliance, as well as those individuals you might encounter that aren't directly tied to the Scourge, is just to make you all realize something. It's all a bit of theory crafting and fun, but the reality is there are likely many people across Azeroth, some you might even call your friends and allies, that at one point were communicating with the Lich King in secret, learning some of the Scourge's magic, and then practicing the arts behind closed doors to discover more. And that is a forgotten piece of background lore that I feel that not only adds more depth and immersion to the world, but really adds to the richness of the Lich King's story and his influence across Azeroth. In Classic WoW, how many NPCs do we encounter that likely pursued the same path as Helcular, becoming a Lich, all on their own, without the eternal service to the Lich King? We may never truly know the answer to that question, but it's a lot of fun to speculate, especially while we're grinding away on mobs in Classic. So I hope you all enjoyed this little video. The world of Azeroth is just full of so much mystery and wonder. I just couldn't help but share some of these ideas with you all, so that maybe like me, while you're adventuring in World of Warcraft, encountering the various mages and wizards of the land, you might pay a bit more attention to their quests and their dialogue to see just how trustworthy they really are. First of all, you have to understand that Hillsbrad is a
It's such a strong contrast to the other zones that you will encounter in Lordaeron as a Horde player. If you chose to be a Forsaken like I did, you were used to haunted woods and monsters lurking amongst clawed-up trees, castles atop mountains, housing sorcerers gone mad due to their meddling with dark magic, and then suddenly, around level 20 or so, you get Hillsbrad Foothills. Nestled on the southern coast of the Eastern Kingdom's northern territories, this zone is the exact opposite of everything that you've known so far. Hillsbrad is beautiful. It's green and it's full of life. The taint of the Scourge hasn't even touched it. Hillsbrad is full of all these lovely trees of multiple colors. There's a gentle river that cuts the zone in half, snow-touched mountains in the north, and the comfortable seaside town of South Shore where sailors and weary travelers rest and share stories from lands far south. And from the moment that I understood the beauty and tranquility of Hillsbrad compared to Tirisfal and Silverpine Forest, it disgusted me. And I admit, as I walked these roads for the first time, I wanted to decorate what appeared to be human lands with the blood of my faction's enemy, the Alliance. Little did I realize, however, what I was in for, because you see, all those years ago, I was playing on Smolderthorn US as an undead mage, and when I first arrived in Hillsbrad, making my way towards Terran Mill, which I had been told was the Horde's refuge in this unblighted zone, a message appeared in the general chat that I still recall to this day. It was a call to arms of sorts. A person said that they were forming a raid party to be a counterattack on some Alliance aggression that had occurred in the zone before my arrival. Now, I had no idea what a raid group was at the time, I admit, but I decided that despite the fact I was so low level, I would help my fellow Horde brothers regardless. And what followed, I can only describe as adrenaline and awe. When I arrived at Terran Mill after having been invited into this raid group, I was greeted to this tremendous host of Horde players. An entire war party had gathered in this small town, composed of 2 or 3 other raid groups, including our own. This massive host was all buffing each other and sharpening their weapons and trading items amongst themselves, preparing for what was to come. And what followed was a charge that I have never seen replicated in any other game. It wasn't a call to battle done for honor points or gear or any sort of reward other than simple revenge upon the Alliance, who had struck a blow against the Horde earlier that same day. Keep in mind, this story takes place all the way back in 2005. So there I am, running alongside undead skeletal horses, wolves, raptors, and kodos, trying to keep pace along with many other lower level individuals who were also contributing to this battle. Now, I didn't know what to expect, but I soon discovered what has made Hillsbrad Foothills such a legendary zone even to this day. Because upon us reaching the town of South Shore, we smashed our way into this Alliance town. We killed the guards and the lower level players in the contested territory without care or without mercy. And as we slaughtered the town's quest NPCs, the vendors and the citizens, aloft there was this cry that rose forth that echoed across the foothills. Suddenly, from amongst the Horde war cries, there were shouts of "incoming" and "watch out." The Alliance had come. It was like a train in the air. There were these griffins all soaring in from Ironforge and distant lands, entire guilds and mercenary players eager for the glory of slaughter and war making. They were descending from the air and landing behind our ranks, if you can imagine it. We were being struck from the front by South Shore guards, and our retreat was being cut off by the Alliance that were flying in at our backs. This huge Horde army that I was a part of, we were pinned in the center of South Shore. And yet, thankfully, through the graveyard we were able to escape. We reformed our lines, and a battle that lasted the whole afternoon ensued. Alliance war parties against entire Horde guilds. The server lagged, the
The zone became decorated with skeletal remains of fallen heroes, and it was glorious. And there have been so many videos made all across YouTube just talking about and honoring these battles that used to happen in Hillsbrad Foothills all those years ago. And it was that day, all those years ago, that I think that I got my first true introduction to Warcraft, or the Warcraft in World of Warcraft. It was that introduction to Hillsbrad Foothills, a zone that to this day is unrivaled as being WoW's most iconic in terms of world PvP and capturing the Warcraft spirit. And I'm sure for many of you that played on PvP servers back in the day, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But unfortunately, if you were to fly out to Hillsbrad Foothills today, the fields are empty. Terran Mill is silent and South Shore is blighted and destroyed. The drums of war are silenced forevermore. And I do admit that sometimes as I walk the roads of Hillsbrad in Classic WoW, I remember, because this battle that I was a part of, this battle that I just told you the story of, it wasn't just a one-off thing. This was a daily occurrence in that zone on PvP realms. The war was never ending back in those days. But why? Like what was it that made this zone so damn filled with PvP? Well, let me explain for those of you that weren't there. I would say that there's a few reasons, but the primary ones are simply this. Terran Mill lies in the north of the zone, and South Shore is in the south, with a road connecting the two towns with a simple tower in the middle. These two player hubs are very close to each other if you look at the zone from above, and of course, with them being so close, this would inspire conflict. But it was also the fact that the quests in this zone played a very huge part in the wars that were waged here. Because you see, many of the quests in Hillsbrad, they were shared by both the Horde and the Alliance, meaning that both factions were naturally seeking the exact same items and mobs to kill, so competition would of course lead to ganking and killing. But there was also the fact that, well, not a lot of people talk about this one, but there was a unique element regarding the Horde quests in this zone that likely would, well, set off Alliance players. Two things, actually. The first thing is Hillsbrad Fields, which is located in the western part of the zone. This is where a bunch of Alliance-friendly NPCs are located. Farmers and citizens. This little town would have been an ideal base for Alliance players with its apple orchards and defendable town hall in the center. But in actuality, this spot is just a questing location for Horde players. There's no reason for Alliance players to really go here. Forsaken, Orcs, Tauren, and Trolls, they were constantly preying on this area of the zone for multiple quests, collecting skulls and whatnot, and just pretty much ruining this entire corner of Hillsbrad Foothills. And I would say that maybe this inspired a little bit of retribution in the hearts of Alliance players, because here they had a ton of friendly NPCs, and yet they were being slaughtered by Horde players. And perhaps this inspired a sense of patriotism in the Alliance players who fought here, as defending Hillsbrad Fields, this was a very common thing that Alliance players did during world PvP in this zone. There was usually always like a group of Alliance players chilling over in the fields, just preventing Horde players from questing. And why? Because denying Horde players access to this really major questing spot was essential to stopping Horde progression in the zone. You also had the elite area in the lower right-hand corner of the zone. This is like a dwarven bunker that Alliance players would hide out in, and they could retreat here if need be to protect themselves if the Horde was overwhelming them in the battle out in the fields. The world PvP in Hillsbrad Fields, in South Shore, over in the Dwarven Fortress, all these locations, and of course in Terran Mill itself, all these locations just made for such epic and memorable battles that as soon as you heard about them, you kind of wanted to go and be a part of them. Hillsbrad was also one of the few flight paths that lower level Alliance players had access to if they wanted to run Shadowfang Keep nearby in Silverpine Forest.
And that's something that many Alliance players needed to do, because if you wanted to do your Paladin class quests, well, you had to go into Shadowfang Keep. And a group of low-level Alliance players getting ganked on the road to Silverpine, that is certainly a way to kickstart a zone-wide conflict, as higher-level Alliance players would naturally want revenge or to act as bodyguards for the newbies, and this would lead to quarrels with higher-level Horde players. Really just what began to happen with Hillsbrad Foothills because of its smaller scale as a zone, because of the fact that these two hubs were so close to each other, Hillsbrad Foothills just began to build this reputation over its time of just being the place that you go if you want to engage in world PvP. And on many PvP servers, this was a zone that was impossible to level in. There was no way you could do it because there were always rogues hiding in the shadows ready to gank you and kill you. There were always groups of players clashing out in the fields, fighting over mobs. It was an impossible to quest in zone, and that only added to Hillsbrad Foothills' PvP reputation. You even had quests on the Horde side of things like Helcular's Revenge, where you actually have to go to South Shore as a Horde player in order to finish the quest chain. You show up there, you get killed by an Alliance player, and it naturally just starts a domino effect that turns into an all-out conflict. It was like Blizzard accidentally designed Hillsbrad Foothills to be this hub of PvP. I know they probably didn't intend for it to be that when they were, designing the zone, but that's what it turned into, and it was absolutely fantastic. And I don't think there's really been a place in World of Warcraft that's really captured this organic Warcraft feeling. Sure, Blizzard has created dedicated PvP zones over the years, like Wintergrasp, for example, but Hillsbrad was different. Hillsbrad wasn't a place where people were fighting over access to a raid boss or to gear or something. There was something about this zone that really captured the imaginations of the players that quested here and fought here. And this is why Hillsbrad Foothills has always been one of my favorite zones in World of Warcraft, not necessarily because of its quests, but because of all the battles and stories that occurred among these trees. Don't get me wrong, there are some very awesome quests and stories to be told about Hillsbrad though, for those of you that played on PvE realms back in the day and actually got to quest through this zone, which I will talk about in future videos here soon. But I just wanted to take a moment to remember Hillsbrad for what it was back in the day. A zone that was so inspirational in regards to PvP that during World of Warcraft's anniversary years later, Blizzard brought the zone back as an entire battleground, which was a little bit of a miss because it wasn't the organic battles of Warcraft past, but it was a nice homage to old Warcraft back in the day. So thank you all for listening to this little nostalgic video, this little window into the past for those of you that were not there.
A long time ago when I was a kid, I went to my grandparents' house up in Kentucky with my mother and father. And while I was there, we briefly went to visit my aunt, and my parents, they left me alone at her house while the adults went and did whatever it is they were doing. Well, I was bored, and I started wandering around her home wondering on what I could do, until eventually I found her collection of VHS tapes, yes, I'm a little bit old, and I decided that I was going to watch a movie. I looked through, all the films that she had, and eventually I settled on one, a movie that I had heard was really good, but I had never seen it. I took this movie out of its case, I put it into the VHS player, turned on the TV, and I began to watch The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. And you know what? I started watching this movie and I didn't understand a thing of what was going on. There were some guys trying to find some two little dudes being carried by some monsters, and two dudes talking to this weird monster looking creature that they found while out in the mountains. I didn't understand at all what was going on, and eventually I turned the movie off and I said, this is garbage. Well, a little while later, while I was back at home and I was back to school, I was riding the bus one day and I was talking to a new friend I had just made whose name was Alan Schmidt. And on this particular morning, I learned that Alan was a really big fan of The Lord of the Rings. And I told him, I said, Alan, I tried watching those movies and I couldn't get into it. Nothing made sense and I just thought it was kind of stupid. And he began to ask me, he was like, how could you say that? Like, what was it about it that you didn't like? And I began to explain the plot that I experienced, and only after a few moments, Alan stopped me and he said, Nixxiom, your problem is that you watched the second movie, or started watching the second movie, before you watched the first. No wonder you were so confused. No wonder you didn't like it. Well, that Friday, Alan invited me over to his house to spend the night for the very first time, and he said that we were going to watch The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. I got my parents' permission, we went over to his home, I rolled out my sleeping bag in the living room, and we sat down with some popcorn and whatever else, and we started to watch this movie. And to say that The Lord of the Rings absolutely blew my mind was an understatement. Shortly thereafter, I had watched Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers. A little bit after that, I finished the trilogy by watching Return of the King, and I knew that these 3 films were going to be some of my favorite movies that I had ever watched for the rest of my life. And turns out I was right. And you know, after watching The Lord of the Rings, something came over my younger self, and I didn't really exactly know how to define it. I started going out into the woods, and oftentimes I would pick up a stick and I would pretend to be Aragorn, and I would be fighting orcs, pretending that all the trees that surrounded me were these monsters, Urukai and trolls and so on. In my free time, I was drawing maps of the Shire and what Moria might have looked like from above, and I dreamed of these far-off misty mountains in the distance that I felt like I could almost touch them, but they were just out of reach, like they were just beyond the horizon, and if I just traveled far enough, I would find them. And you know, this feeling, this sense of wonder that The Lord of the Rings gave me, this sense that this was a real place at one point in history, or a real place just hidden behind a veil whose, form I didn't know how to peel back from my eyes. I didn't really know how to describe that feeling, so I just considered myself a fan. And in those days, as I was growing up, I would often use The Lord of the Rings and Middle-earth as a type of happy place, if we want to use that term. I would just go to that corner of my mind and I would fall into Middle-earth and I would escape. And all the troubles of school and girls and friend drama, it would all just fade away for a time. By this point, too, in my life, I was also playing World of Warcraft, which I also found to be very immersive for me. It gave me a very similar experience with all of its different races, with different stories, this huge world of adventure and different landscapes to explore, the music and the ambience. I loved it. And this game, too, whenever I would play it when I was younger, it as well filled me with this sense of great imagination, and I would draw pictures of my characters and write simple stories of adventures through the various zones of Azeroth. At this point, The Lord of the Rings, they were my 3 favorite movies, and also World of Warcraft had quickly become my favorite video game that I had ever played. And as I got older, I started to seek out this undefined feeling in any game that I played, or TV show or book that I read. I was looking for these stories and adventures and whatever that could capture me in the way that The Lord of the Rings and Classic WoW had all those years ago. And I especially sought out these worlds and experiences whenever I went through a period of great stress or sadness or whatever sort of struggle I was going through growing up. Even in my later teenage years, I still didn't know exactly what it was I was looking for. I just enjoyed fantasy as far as I understood things. That was until one day after high school, while I was in college, I read Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, which finally gave proper words to this feeling that I had experienced while watching Lord of the Rings or playing Classic WoW back when I was younger. What I had experienced is what Tolkien would call enchantment and escapism. Now, Tolkien, he describes enchantment as a type of fairy magic in this essay, and it's something that occurs when a person is pulled into a secondary created world, pulled out from our world, which he calls the primary world. Tolkien describes it like a prisoner who is in a cell, who is dreaming of the world outside, the beauty of it all, and what sort of sights and smells and sounds the prisoner might be able to capture with his senses as he perceives the world outside. And all of us, Tolkien would argue at least, have a deep need for this feeling, a deep need for escapism and enchantment. But I'll talk about why in a moment. First of all, I'll say that the act of creating one of these secondary worlds, however, capable of actually producing enchantment in the person who reads it or watches it or plays it in the form of a video game, this is incredibly difficult. Especially nowadays, it's a very common criticism that there are so many forms of entertainment out there where the author or the director or the developer, they only care about creating a product that appeals to as many people as possible to make as much money as possible. And so the world and its story and its characters and its immersive quality is just pushed to the side as a secondary or an unnecessary element in the production. Or in many cases today, we have developers that seem more interested in lecturing the viewer about a particular issue rather than creating an actual world for that person to fall into and be a part of. I often see people criticizing modern video games for inserting unnecessary political dialogue, revising history, or just doing things that are unnecessary that immediately break the enchantment of the game. I can even use World of Warcraft as an example. Now, World of Warcraft, it might not be a game that you yourself play or enjoy, but I think I can use it as an example of what I'm getting at here. When you compare the original game to the modern game, Classic WoW, which is the original game, it's more about discovering a greater world full of stories and diverse peoples and perspectives with no clear objective answer as to who is the most good or most evil, whose ideas or worldview is more superior and whose are lacking. You have groups like the Forsaken who seek to turn their enemies and even their allies into undead to make everybody just as ugly as they are. Night Elves, they struggle with being in an alliance with younger, lesser races of Azeroth, as they would put it, considering that many Night Elves are thousands of years old. Orcs, they are being led by a war chief who is raised by humans who doesn't even truly understand Orcish traditions and culture. All across Azeroth, there are all these different peoples, all these different conflicts, creating war, creating tension, creating real drama that actually can pull at your heartstrings, make you think, or allow you to be more immersed into the world as you insert yourself into greater conflicts. And all I gave you is just 3 examples of 3 small groups in this massive world of stories and adventure, and now compare that to the game today. Today, we have the Draenei race and the Orcs. They are working together to defeat Xalatath, the current primary antagonist, despite the fact that the Orcs nearly wiped out the entire Draenei race from existence in a mass genocide event, the evidence of which is the Path of Glory in Hellfire Peninsula. These are the bodies of all the men, women, and children the Orcs killed all across Draenor, and yet for some reason, it's as if the Draenei no longer care. Night Elves, I mentioned them before, they have now accepted mages into their ranks. Now keep in mind, back in the day, you couldn't play as a Night Elf mage, and why? Because for 10,000 years in the lore, these people have had a deep distrust of arcane magic due to it being the reason that the world was sundered and broken into the continents that you see here. And it was because of arcane magic that the Burning Legion was first able to enter Azeroth, almost plunging the entire world into demonic corruption and death. It's why the Night Elves are so druidic in the first place rather than magical arcane users like they used to be. 10,000 years of no tolerance in their society towards the arcane, however, all that lore is gone. Simply because the consumer wants to play a Night Elf mage. And so now all that established lore that was built up over many years, books, quests, and stories, it all doesn't matter now. Or we can just be very broad with it. How about how every expansion is all about how all the people of the world just need to come together as a big family, to quote the Dragonflight expansion, to defeat the next big nobody cares villain. Now, it is true that since the days of Warcraft 3, the World of Warcraft universe has always kind of been about these different factions uniting to fight a common threat, and yet over the years, as the various races of Azeroth have lost their unique identity, the story that Blizzard Entertainment created that used to move and inspire and immerse so many, it's just been watered down to a very generic story that serves only to waste your time, rather than present to you an actual world of many peoples to fall into, at least in my opinion. Friends, it is a criticism that exists not just in World of Warcraft, but in many game universes, many television shows, many books, and many films. So many universes that we used to delight in have been degraded to nothing more than teenage tier soap operas, rather than actual rich fantasy. And you want to know why? Because so many creators all around the world have lost their sense of creating enchantment and escapism. Now, I know that some of you are probably going to ask how to create good enchantment or escapism in a game or a movie or whatever, and that is something I'd love to talk about, but probably in a separate video. If that's something that you guys would like to see, just leave a comment down below. But I know there's also probably a lot of you sitting there thinking, who cares? I mean, after all, you know, this sort of stuff, the falling into one's imagination, some of you think it seems very childish and naive, pointless. It's something that many people condemn because they see escapism and enchantment as being simple distraction, not real, pointless, a waste of time. This is something Tolkien talks about very extensively in his essay. Let's return to Tolkien, because I mentioned before that he discussed in his essay that escapism and enchantment, they are necessary to our lives. And in fact, it is one of the purest art forms that one can experience. And let me explain to you why. Why do we need stories like The Lord of the Rings that can capture the imaginations of young boys and girls all around the world? Why is it such a big deal that so many of the worlds and the stories that we are creating today are lacking in enchanting and escaping quality? Let me put it this way. Most of you, according to my analytics behind the scenes here on YouTube, most of you are men. Men between the age of 25 and 35. And gentlemen, let me speak to you as one of you. Sometimes life is kind of a bitch. Life is hard. Life is cruel sometimes. It's rugged, it's not clean. And as we wrestle with the responsibilities of our jobs, or taking care of our family, or dealing with the cesspit of negativity that pollutes social media these days, sometimes we just need a break. A break from the pursuit of higher career advancement or just our jobs, whatever it is. We need rest. And there is silence to be found in a church, or comfort to be found in the company of a cigar lounge, or maybe just taking a hike in the forest can be very relaxing. But then there is another place where we can find rest, all of us, not just men, and that is in enchantment. For it's in that moment that we are captured by the fairy story, as Tolkien would put it. In the moment that we're captured by that world, we are reminded of so much, like the beauty of our world, the primary world, and man's capacity for virtue. And even sometimes the mundane becomes wondrous in its quality. The hero, he inspires us to be something greater than what we already are. In him, we see the capacity for bravery in a man, even in the most impossible of challenges. The beautiful maiden, so fair that her very gaze, it captures us and inspires a delight in the writing of poetry and the singing of songs, these sad attempts at communicating the love that we have for her mere presence alone. We see the mountains of a world that we cannot touch. We can hear songs of elves that we do not see. We can experience the whisper of gods seated upon high thrones. And suddenly, without even realizing it, we find ourselves hiking in the nearby woods, searching behind hills for secret doors into dwarven halls that stretch for miles beneath the earth. And perhaps some of you guys will laugh because, after all, none of this is true.
And maybe you're right, but in the quiet corner of our spirits, whose door we keep shut to the outside world due to embarrassment and our fear of ridicule, a small piece of us, those of us who have experienced enchantment and who have escaped into fantastical worlds, there is this small piece of us that truly wants to believe that somewhere out there, hidden in a place that man has never walked, there is a place where fantasy comes to life in our primary world. And I would say that it's this longing for enchantment, this longing for escape into a secondary world for a time, just to give us reprieve from the woes and stresses and heartaches of this world. That's why we're so drawn to the Dungeons and Dragons table, rolling dice and immersing ourselves into a world that a group of friends have created together to go exploring within. And maybe that's why we dress up and we go to Renaissance fairs, or we put on the armor of our ancestors and we fight on battlefields, letting ourselves fall into the fantastical and romantic realm of the past, or of elves and gods and heroes. And in a curious way, that enchantment that we experience as we don the armor and we pick up the sword or the spear, somehow it manifests itself into the primary world. And suddenly our art galleries are filled with these beautiful paintings of fairies and spirits. Our wardrobe consists of tunics and swords and wizard staffs, and just for the delight of it all, because it's in enchantment and escapism that for a brief moment, we leave who we are and what we know behind, and we rest. And then we return restored, as Tolkien put it. Restored with a new appreciation for even the most simple and ordinary things. The world, it's bright again and full of color like when we were children. The rustle of the leaves, it's like a language that only the most learned of poets can understand. And although we must endure the doldrums of our days, our world feels more wondrous, because the secondary world of enchantment that we fell into reminds us of just how beautiful life truly is. I admit, everybody, I'm not reading off a script. I'm just rambling from the heart right now, trying to describe something that Tolkien did a far better job at communicating than I ever could. I'll just say that when it comes to good fantasy and role-playing games, whether it's a video game or even a D&D campaign, if you're a DM, you want to create escapism. Speaking as a DM, actually, a creator myself of a secondary world, I've been doing a homebrew campaign for a very long time now. I want my players to be enchanted when they play my game. I want my characters and lands and stories and magic and encounters to really move them in a way, to make them think, to make them wonder, to leave them a little bit in awe. And when we're at the table, I want them to be truly immersed, and I want them to be able to escape into the world that, yes, I have made as the DM, but that they are helping to create. I want the table to be a place of rest for them before they have to go back to work on Monday. And that's my goal anyway. That's my goal as a DM. It's my goal whenever I am playing a video game or watching a movie or whatever. I'm always seeking that enchantment. I'm always seeking that sense of escapism. And it's why I talk about it so much when it comes to gaming. It's why immersion is so important to me. So speaking to game developers out there, or any sort of creator that makes secondary worlds, you know, if the goal of immersion, if it is just cast aside in the favor of achievement points and meaningless grinds and pointless collecting, or for you just making an entire show or movie or book just so that you can make a statement, not to immerse, but to just appease your own ego and your own insecurity with the way things are, I don't think that you're creating a world that enchants. You're not creating a world for people to escape into. I think you're just creating a big waste of time. Our tale begins not with clashing swords or thundering armies, but with a single man, a mage of the Kirin Tor named Kel'Thuzad. Once a respected Archmage of Dalaran, Kel'Thuzad grew disillusioned with the rigid arcane traditions of his peers. He hungered for forbidden knowledge, for power that transcended life and death, and from out of the frozen wastes of Northrend, a voice answered his greed for power. It was not a man who called him, nor any beast of the world of Azeroth, but a suit of armor trapped within a frozen tower of ice. And it promised Kel'Thuzad dominion over mortality itself, and the mage, seduced by visions of eternal rule, began to listen to the words of this strange voice. Despite the protests of his peers and near banishment due to his experiments on dead rats, Kel'Thuzad persisted in his ambitions that ultimately took him to those frozen wastes of Northrend, where, unknown to all, he pledged his very soul to the being whom he now called the Lich King. The story of which, called Road to Damnation, I recently read for heroic channel members right here on Nixxiom, if you all want to check that out after this video. The Lich King gave to the wizard a new purpose: to create a group of like-minded individuals to serve the frozen throne from afar, advancing the aims of their dark master. Kel'Thuzad, he was told, would be their leader, an ambassador to the living from the Lich King himself. Thus, the Cult of the Damned was born, an insidious web of fanatics woven in secrecy across Lordaeron's underbelly. Kel'Thuzad returned from Northrend not as a lone heretic, but as a prophet, offering listeners the chance at immortal life. And so he slithered into the kingdom's fringes, whispering promises to the desperate and the ambitious, disgruntled nobles, weary peasants burdened by taxes from endless wars, and even disillusioned priests who questioned the light's mercy. They all fell under his words and the Lich King's spell. The cult masqueraded as a benevolent order, offering salvation from the world's woes. "Join us," they murmured in taverns and shadowed alleys, "and transcend the frailties of flesh." But their true gospel was necromancy, the art of raising the dead as slaves to an unholy will. The immortality they offered? A chance to linger in the world as a decaying body, bound in service to a master seated upon a frozen spire of ice. And would you believe it? Many listened and began to follow. At first, the corruption was subtle, like a rot hidden beneath a blooming rose. Cultists infiltrated granaries and trade routes, their dark rituals infusing shipments with an insidious plague they had been ordered to spread. But this was no ordinary sickness. It was a carefully manufactured plague of undeath, a demonic concoction brewed in shadowy cauldrons, bubbling with green bile and ooze. The Lich King's design was masterful, turning the kingdom's own sustenance against it. Grain carts rolled out from towns like Anderhall, which was a bustling hub in Lordaeron's heartlands, laden with tainted flour. Bakers kneaded it into loaves, families shared it at their hearths, and soldiers rationed it in their barracks. The Cult of the Damned's plague began slowly at first, but soon it spread like wildfire through dry grass, silent but swift. The symptoms appeared overnight: feverish chills, blackened veins crawling across the skin like spiderwebs, and then death. But death was not the end. Victims rose again as mindless undead, ghouls with hollow eyes, shambling abominations hungering for the living. Outlying villages fell first, then Lordaeron's major cities began to show symptoms. Fear began to spread throughout the kingdom, just as Kel'Thuzad and his dark master had anticipated. What fires of hope remained were held in the hearts of Lordaeron's noble knights and paladins, yet even they, in quiet moments, began to doubt. Had the light begun to abandon them? Now, enter Prince Arthas Menethil, the heir to Lordaeron's throne, a golden-haired paladin whose hammer gleamed with holy light. Arthas was the kingdom's hope made manifest, a fierce warrior trained under Uther the Lightbringer and the Knights of the Silver Hand, sworn to defend the innocent. And when reports of the plague reached Capital City, he was swift to ride out with unyielding resolve. "I will stop this," he vowed, his words an oath to himself and to his people. Alongside the mage Jaina Proudmoore, his love, he traced the plague to its source, the fallen wizard Kel'Thuzad and his Cult of the Damned hiding around and within Anderhall. In a blaze of righteous fury, Arthas confronted the necromancer amid fields of withered crops. Kel'Thuzad mocked him, proclaiming that his death at the prince's hands would mean little in the end. It was already over for Lordaeron. The son of King Terenas had little choice but surrender and submit to the will of the damned. But Arthas, he proceeded to strike the founder of the Cult of the Damned down. But his victory, the prince soon discovered, was indeed a hollow one. The plague raged on, and more reports poured in of settlements falling to the strange sickness or the undead hordes that haunted the forests of the country. Driven by desperation, Arthas rode north to Stratholme. A once thriving port city, it was soon to become a charnel house. Lordaeron's proud city was already beginning to bleed from within, some of her people twisting into monsters that swelled the Scourge's ranks. The Scourge, that was the name for this growing army of the dead, an unstoppable tide orchestrated by the Lich King from his frozen throne afar. And it was there at Stratholme that Arthas discovered the horrible truth. The city's grain was tainted, its greater populace hours from turning into undead. In a moment that would shatter his soul, Arthas made a fateful choice. "This entire city must be purged," he declared, ordering his men to slaughter the infected before they could rise into the undead. Uther, his teacher, and Jaina, his lover, they both recoiled in horror, ultimately abandoning Arthas to his supposed madness. Despite any protest or doubts, however, the noble prince waded into the streets with his loyal men to be greeted by cheers and cries that Stratholme had been saved by the young man's presence alone. How wrong they were. Arthas's hammer crushed skulls, blood stained his armor. The once shining prince of Lordaeron was now decorated with the entrails and curses of his own people. And that is when something curious occurred. A demon made itself manifest before him, Mal'Ganis. And this creature told the young prince that the city of Stratholme now belonged to him. With Mal'Ganis raising the citizens of the city into undeath and Arthas slaughtering his own people before they could turn, it was a brutal affair. Stratholme burned that night, a pyre of screams and smoke, but the plague spread only accelerated elsewhere. Obsession consumed Arthas. He had to stop the plague at its source. He assumed it was Kel'Thuzad, but this Mal'Ganis clearly was the Scourge's true origin, or so he believed at the time. So he sailed to Northrend, defying warnings, seeking Mal'Ganis and a legendary rune blade called Frostmourne, said to hold the power to end the Scourge. And in the icy caverns of the Northlands, he found it, guarded by echoes of the past, whispering of the blade's terrible curse. "Whomsoever takes up this blade shall wield power eternal," the inscription read. "Just as the blade rends flesh, so must power scar the spirit." Ignoring his friend Muradin Bronzebeard's pleas to retreat, Arthas claimed Frostmourne. The sword shattered its icy prison, killing Muradin in the blast, and bound the unknowing soul of Arthas to the Lich King. And now, at last, the prince understood the truth of it all. The great plan of the Frozen Throne was laid bare before his eyes. Lordaeron would be entirely destroyed by the Scourge, and Arthas would be the Lich King's instrument in striking the final blows. Ironic. Transformed into a Death Knight, Arthas tested his newfound powers by slaughtering the demon Mal'Ganis. But this victory too was an illusion, for the Lich King's voice now thundered in his head. "Now, return to me, my champion," it said. Arthas vanished into the wastelands of the north, where the whispers of the Frozen Throne consumed him. But the prince did not remain in Northrend, no. His once noble heart encased in frost, Arthas sailed back to his home of Lordaeron. His eyes glowed with unholy blue fire, his will no longer his own. The Lich King's orders ever gnawing at his thoughts. He would return, but with a specific purpose in mind. His kingdom, already weakened by plague and undead hordes, welcomed its prince like a returning hero. King Terenas, aged and weary, he stood to embrace his son in the throne room, oblivious to the shadow that had claimed him. "What is this?" Terenas gasped as Arthas drew Frostmourne. "What are you doing, my son?" In a single chilling stroke, Arthas plunged the blade into the king's chest. Blood pooled onto the marble floors as Tyrannus slumped lifeless, his crown clattering aside. "This kingdom shall fall," Arthas declared, his voice a hollow echo, "and from the ashes shall arise a new order that will shake the very foundations of the world." With the king slain, Lordaeron crumbled from a lack of clear authority and direction. Undead legions poured forth from the crypts, overwhelming any local guard. The capital's streets ran red, its people raised as Scourge minions, the paladins of the Silver Hand, Arthas's former order. They tried to keep the light of hope and some semblance of structure alight amidst the growing shadow, but they too scattered into the forests and fled when their leader, Uther the Lightbringer, Arthas's mentor and teacher, was slain by the very prince he had raised with such pride. When Uther fell, the people of Lordaeron declared, all hope died with him. Arthas proceeded to exhume Kel'Thuzad's remains, summoning him back as a Lich to help command the growing army of undead. "I told you," the necromancer laughed, "my death would mean little." He had been right, Arthas had to admit. The Lich King had orchestrated everything perfectly. All of his pawns moving on the board exactly as the frozen throne willed. Strange, though, Arthas had to admit. He still felt no remorse, no shame, no pity. Lordaeron, that once proud Lady Jewel of the North, now lay in ruins. Her towers toppled, her king killed, her lands blighted, her spirit broken. What remained became what is today called the Plague Lands, a haunted wasteland where the living dare not tread. What remains are merely the undead and the weeping ghosts of Lordaeron's former citizens. The fall of Lordaeron began simply with a whisper, the voice of an unknown power afar, making fine promises in the ear of an ambitious mage. And it ended with the Crown Prince ascending Icecrown Glacier, merging with that magical suit of armor trapped within the frozen throne. The circle was now complete. The kingdom had fallen. Its prince now sat atop the frozen throne as a new Lich King, and an era of undeath began, a scar on Azeroth that heroes would fight to heal for generations. And so, dear viewers, remember, even the brightest realms can fall to the shadow. And if this tale of tragedy and betrayal gripped you, please consider liking and subscribing for more dives into Warcraft's shadowed lore. When I was younger, first making my way through Hillsbrad Foothills attempting to quest in this world PvP infested zone, the Alterac Mountains loomed overhead, almost beckoning me to explore them. And after turning in a few quests in Terran Mill one day, I looked north and thought to myself, well, why not? I had a few quests that were telling me to venture into those snowy mountains. They were red quests and elite quests, however, but I figured I would just avoid any elite NPCs that I would encounter in my adventure. But little did I realize what my younger self was about to discover. Alterac Mountains is a curious zone in Classic WoW in that many quests in Hillsbrad Foothills will take you up into this corner of the Eastern Kingdoms, and yet there is no established hubs for either Horde or Alliance to take shelter in. Alterac Mountains is the ruin of the Kingdom of Alterac, and it genuinely feels that way with all of its decaying walls and buildings and snowy emptiness that decorates the land. My first trek into the Alterac Mountains, well, it didn't really go exactly how I expected. I went north, and immediately I was surrounded by ogres far higher level than I was. They were like a wall that immediately said, "You do not belong here." Yet my love of exploration and of snowy mountain peaks made me want to explore all the more. Maybe you'll laugh, but perhaps like in the Fellowship of the Ring, I imagined myself in the high misty mountains, soon to be wading through snow while dodging terrible dangers that roamed those forgotten valleys and hills. Something about this place enchanted me, and I ventured on deeper, dodging the ogres as I went. And something that I found almost immediately that surprised me was a small, ruined village similar to Terran Mill that I had just departed from. And it seemed, at least from where I was at the time, that the ogres did not occupy this ruined little area of the mountains, so I was quick to flee in this direction. Now, my assumption was that this little village was the Horde hub in this zone, a sort of sister town to Terran Mill, but how wrong I was. Because immediately I was set upon by syndicate rogues, and this was my first exposure to this mysterious group who I intend to make a video on here soon. And the reason why is because I'd wager that most of WoW's player base, if they were asked, who are the syndicate, where did they come from, and what is their overall goal, they don't know the answer. Now, the syndicate, they forced me to flee from this village, but not before I caught sight of this location's name. And the words flashing on my screen would later be significant in my Warcraft journey, because this village was called Stronbrad. And if you've ever played Warcraft 3, it's one of the locations that Arthas visits in the human campaign early on. And I just discovered it in World of Warcraft. Now, at this point in my life, I had never played Warcraft 3. World of Warcraft was my very first ever Warcraft game, fun fact. But later on during TBC, when I did play Warcraft 3 for the first time, I did this part of the human campaign, and then I thought back to this village hidden atop the mountains, and I was struck by this immediate need to go back there and explore it in more depth. Because after all, Arthas Menethil had once tread here, and I loved retracing his footsteps in World of Warcraft. But little did I realize that my journey in the Alterac Mountains had just begun. I do want to pause here for 1 second just to say two things. First, I want to thank this channel's sponsor, Zygor, which is linked down below in the description. It's WoW's Ultimate Guide add-on if you want to get ahead in the game, and you can use code Nixxiom for 20% off if you want. And second, I wanted to tell you all that I am pleased to announce that we have just finished our Tales of Warcraft design recently. A new type of shirt is now available on the Nixxiom Corner store if you want to help support this sort of lore content here on the channel. Let me know what you all think of this design in the comment section down below, and now let's return to the journey. So after being attacked by a bunch of invisible syndicate rogues, I ultimately had to flee north, away from Stronbrad, and along the rim of the snowy area of Alterac's ruins. And it was there, dodging the Yetis and the ogres, that I soon discovered the ruins of a former kingdom. Alterac's capital, shattered by whatever force destroyed it. It laid silent in the snow, occupied by the ogres that wandered amongst the ruins. There's always been something about this particular place in WoW that's always captured my imagination too, especially when it's snowing in this zone. The former capital of a nation, high atop the frozen mountains, now occupied by a simple-minded enemy force that dig amongst what remains, looking for what food, scrap metal, and tools that still might be hidden in the snow and debris. I didn't know what Alterac was, I didn't know what happened here, but the visuals alone inspired me to learn more and to dig more into WoW's storyline. It's strange. This zone has always made me feel so far away from everything, especially as I stood atop the hills of Alterac's kingdom, looking down towards Fenris Isle and Lake Lordaeron below. Now sure, there is the Dalaran bubble that was present back in Classic WoW, the Orc internment camp just south of it, as well as the mysterious two houses alongside the lake in the north, but the ruins of Alterac and of Stronbrad are the true heart of this zone, and when most think of Alterac Mountains, I would guess that these old towers and wandering ogres are what they immediately think of. And beyond that place, beyond the ruined capital, there was the green lowlands of the Alterac Mountains. Dalaran's bubble loomed in the distance in those days, now replaced by a large crater. And there were even those homes that I mentioned earlier, located down near Lordaeron Lake, that I soon realized were also occupied by the same syndicate that ran me out of Stronbrad. And I explored both all those years ago. First the homes near the lake edge, and then the ruins of Dalaran occupied by mages wandering with their stone elemental guardians. And I think it was as I passed through Dalaran on my undead mage at the time, dodging frost bolts and cougar claw stripes, that I realized something about World of Warcraft, or at least this area in WoW, that has still stayed with me to this day. I realized in this moment just how destroyed the North really was. It's not just the plague lands and the areas occupied by the Scourge. The capital city of Lordaeron and Tirisfal Glades, where I began my journey, that place is in ruins. Silverpine Forest, whatever it used to be, it's now just a haunted wood filled with worgen. Forsaken and Dalaran mages just trying to carve out a living amongst those haunted trees. You have Dalaran in ruins, hidden within a bubble. This Alterac kingdom also is in ruins. The Plague Lands, of course, they're the ultimate place of ruin, and even at one point, I had passed by Stromgarde in Arathi, seeing that it too was a ruined capital of sorts. The north of the Eastern Kingdoms truly is a place of destruction. And it was in the exploring of Alterac Mountains that I got a vibe of an almost post-apocalyptic sense, yet in a fantasy setting. You have all these major cities and nations, they've all been destroyed. And there's these various small parties trying to survive amongst the rubble of it all, be they Ogre, Horde, Alliance, or whatever. And yes, there's small towns like South Shore and Airy Peak in the hinterlands that felt old and established and perhaps fortified either by mountains or simple distance from the conflicts that destroyed these kingdoms. But these places are few and far between. Most of the north of the Eastern Kingdoms is empty. It's survivors living on scraps, and maybe this is why I've always enjoyed this corner of Azeroth so much. A land that was once tamed and yet now has collapsed. And in my journey through the Alterac Mountains all those years ago, as I neared the end of it, I passed the Lordaeron internment camp, this small fortress that once housed Orcish prisoners by the Alliance. I knew that much about the lore at least. The Orcs, they were slaves for the most part, forced to live in terrible conditions by the Alliance of the North. Now for most people, I would assume when they think of the internment camps, they think of Lordaeron being the main culprit in this terrible treatment of the Orcs. But here was a camp just outside of Dalaran. And well, I wondered how many Orcs were used by the wizards of Dalaran back in the day as test subjects for experiments or as living targets to test out new ruinous spells. As I passed by that camp, and even today, I can only speculate. But this camp's close location to Dalaran, it doesn't really make that theory so impossible. And it's one that I've held ever since that day. All that time ago, I remember thinking about the Orcs way afar in Orgrimmar, what they had escaped from as a people, and the home that they had built in a desert to escape this degree of oppression and persecution at the hands of humans, dwarves, gnomes, and high elves. And perhaps, for a moment, my rotten, forsaken heart pitied the poor greenskins. But I admit the empathy was short-lived, for Tirisfal Glades, Silverpine Forest, and beyond had hardened me into a loyalist to my people, the Forsaken. And I knew it was my responsibility to slaughter anyone that stood in our way, even our own allies, if need be. Pity for the Orcs be damned. The last thing that I will say about the Alterac Mountains is something rather special about this zone. At least it was very special for me, and it's unknown to many in this game. It wasn't on the same day that I went on this adventure that I'm telling you all about, but sometime later, while exploring around these mountains yet again, I came face to face with my first dragon, Naralasands. He is a red drake that can be found in the mountains north of Hillsbrad. And when I first encountered this guy, I was stunned. I had heard of dragons in World of Warcraft before, but I had never seen one. And this elite drake, it almost suggested to me that perhaps the red dragonflight had some sort of a nest or a clutch nearby. And so I ran from this elite dragon, as I was in no way capable of slaying such a powerful enemy. But I remember after finding this drake, I went on a new adventure up into the Alterac Mountains and the surrounding areas, looking for more dragons. I was a bit higher level at this point. I felt like I could do it. And because, who doesn't want to be like the Geet Beowulf or Siegfried and be remembered as a dragon slayer? Now, unfortunately, I will say that I wandered around for a while and I did not find any more drakes or dragon nests hidden up in the hills. But I did find the hideout of Ravenholt Manor in those days, a secret area for rogues in Classic WoW, which admittingly I never got to experience properly back in the day, as I never leveled a rogue in Classic WoW all those years ago. Regardless, discovering this little hidden corner of Azeroth, it really made me feel like a true adventurer, and I think that's something special about this zone that so few areas truly capture in World of Warcraft. Alterac Mountains and my exploration of it, it's just a really fond memory of mine when it comes to my days playing WoW back when I was younger. It was a zone that truly made me appreciate the scale of the world and its history and its visual storytelling all the more. It enchanted me with its snowy peaks and the beautiful views atop the hills, and to this day, it remains one of my favorite out-of-the-way locations in WoW, and honestly, I'm kinda happy that Blizzard didn't put any Horde or Alliance towns or hubs in this zone, no flight paths, because it made the mountains feel far away. It made them feel foreboding and even terrifying as a low-level player. And perhaps maybe some of you guys feel the exact same way about this zone, maybe you don't, but I do appreciate you all listening to my little reflection on this forgotten corner of Azeroth, and I'm really looking forward to making some videos for you all here soon, highlighting some of the quests from not only Hillsbrad Foothills, but Alterac Mountains as well.
High above the Hillsbrad Foothills is a reach of mountains, towering over the surrounding land. Blanketed in an eternal winter, these spires of stone and ice were the seat of a once mighty kingdom. Proud in its history, Alterac stood for generations alongside its neighboring sister kingdoms, Lordaeron, Stromgarde, Gilneas, and others, a kingdom carrying the legacy of Arathor and Strom from years past. But they are a topic for another day when our path takes us east into the Arathi Highlands. It was the people of Alterac who negotiated trade between their neighboring kingdoms and the dwarven Longbeards, and it was they who Stromgarde considered their greatest rival in the region. Often, these two kingdoms would clash due to politics or disagreement, and little to no ground would be gained or lost between them. So resilient were those men of the mountains, Stromgarde's sons found themselves often buried and forgotten beneath the great depths of Alterac's snow. Banners of orange waved proudly in the winter's blizzards and could clearly be seen for miles around within the summer fog that blanketed the land. That was the kingdom of Alterac in its day, a jewel of the north of the eastern kingdoms, perhaps destined at one point to be a nation greater than all others, and yet corruption and cowardice has a way of slithering into men's hearts like a serpent, especially when a kingdom is faced with so terrible of foes seeking its ruin. In a time of great peace, when Alterac was delighting in its prosperity, that is when the orcs came. When the dark portal opened in the south and ruin came to Stormwind, word reached the north quickly of the city's destruction. The savage greenskins, corrupted by yet-to-be-understood demonic magic, stormed through their accursed waygate and wreaked havoc on all those who stood in their path. The villages surrounding Stormwind fell first, and soon the city itself. The stone walls melted from how great the fires burned, and the orcs, drunk with battle lust, spared none as they washed through the city streets like a rising tide. No soldier they spared, nor woman nor pink child. The orcs delighted greatly in the honor they won for themselves that day. But in the north, however, the human kingdoms were greatly disturbed. Refugees from Stormwind fled north. Those who survived braved the cold of the Khazmadan Mountains, as well as the shivering seas and harsh storms offshore. When the survivors landed in the Northlands, they told their terrible tale of the ruin of their homes and the death of their king, assassinated by the orcs, they said. Now all the leaders of the northern human kingdoms met and discussed what to do, lest they be afflicted to the same terrible fate. Peasant, noble, and king were all united by their terror, for the horde would soon sail and march north. Something had to be done. There was a great summit that was called the Meeting of Seven Kingdoms: Alterac, Dalaran, Lordaeron, Gilneas, Kultaras, Stromgarde, and the remnants of Stormwind. And together, these 7 groups decided that if they were to survive the orcish invasion of Azeroth, they would need to stand united. Alterac, however, for reasons of their own, were
cautious about getting entangled in this conflict. After all, their mountains were high and cold. What would orcs care for their lands compared to the rich and fertile territories of their sister kingdoms? It was King Aiden Paranold of Alterac who raised a voice of opposition to this military union of the Seven Kingdoms. He pushed instead for negotiation with the Greenskins, but his word was quickly shot down. These were monsters, it was shouted, with no thought or sense behind their blood fury. They could not be negotiated with. War was the only language these savages could speak, and King Aiden reluctantly went silent. The Second War, as it's now called, saw the involvement of some of Alterac's soldiers who felt patriotic for kingdoms they had never known. They were men of Azeroth, humans, and their brothers and sisters in lands afar had suffered tremendously in the south. Perhaps this is what motivated them to board ships and take up positions in battalions to go and fight the savage horde. Whatever the reasons, compared to Lordaeron and Stromgarde, Gilneas, and the other kingdoms, Alterac sent little in the form of assistance south, something that greatly displeased the other kings of the north. It was during this conflict with the orcs and their twisted magics that the Alliance saw a number of great victories, but also terrifying defeats. The orcs, driven by their lust for conquest, but also exploration of this foreign world, made their way north until they arrived at the southern reach of Quel'Thalas, the home of the High Elves. And it was then, as the orcs began to clash with elven steel, that King Aiden Paranold of Alterac found that a shadow of doubt had crept its way into his evening rest. His dreams became nightmares, and his days were filled with discussion with hopeless nobles. If the ancient power of the elves could not stop the orcs, it was clear that humanity could not either. And that is when something changed in the noble hearts of Alterac's leaders. Fear for safety became paranoia, and obsession with death became panic solutions to problems hundreds of miles away. On a fateful day, the king of Alterac contacted the war chief of the horde, Orgrim Doomhammer, and attempted to do what he had suggested all that time ago in council with the other kingdoms. The king tried to negotiate for the survival of his kingdom. Discussion went long into the night, but when all was said and done, Alterac agreed to allow the orcs to pass freely through their mountains without fear of harassment. And in return, Alterac would be spared the orcish horde and would even be safeguarded by Doomhammer once the other human kingdoms were conquered. Historians agree that whatever noble character Alterac had, it died on that day, for it was after this dark agreement was struck that further corruption spread through the high mountains. Alterac became responsible for harassing Alliance caravans, for plotting assassination attempts, and even guiding orcish war vessels at sea. But it was only after the Battle of Crestfall did the Alliance truly discover the degree of betrayal that they had suffered. Survivors of the battle, Alterac soldiers, were captured and interrogated, who revealed what had happened in King Aiden's court. And when the news of this scheme between Alterac and the Horde had fully spread across the Alliance's war tents and council chambers, all eyes became set on King Aiden's high, white mountains. Alterac, as far as the other kings of the Alliance were concerned, was to be brought to ruin, along with their filthy Horde allies. And so it happened. Stromgarde marched on Alterac first, and then Lordaeron, led by King Taranis himself, and the once mighty Alterac kingdom, high-seated amongst the snowy peaks, was brought low by the combined power of the Alliance. The orange banners burned in the night, and the fog retreated from the hills to reveal all of the secret dealings that had occurred in this land. Many of the king's loyalists fled, and yet, despite the city's destruction at the hands of its former allies, the king of Alterac and those who remained continued to honor their pledge to the Horde, hoping, praying, and dreaming that the orcs would pull off a great victory and bestow lands and honors on Alterac and their king. Yet, no such victory ever came.
In the aftermath of the Second War, after the Horde had been defeated, Alterac fell into greater ruin. King Aiden, who had been placed under house arrest and stripped of any true authority that he once commanded, he died in his sleep. His kingdom, however, now under Alliance martial law, became a den of banditry, murder, and degeneracy. Men starved in the winter's cold, and those who were smart did what they could to flee the dying lands. That is when ogres crept into the ruins of Alterac's villages and city like maggots on a corpse. The local Yeti population exploded in their numbers, and the mountains soon became too dangerous to travel through alone. During the events of Classic WoW, the condition of Alterac is what you see here, one of destruction. For King Tyrannus and the Alliance showed this kingdom no mercy for its betrayal. And yet, my friends, although the failure of King Aiden Paranold led to the doom of his land, there still remained a remnant of his people, now led by Aiden's son, whose name was Aladin Paranold. And it was Aladin, after his father's death, who came to the conclusion that the Horde truly were savage beasts who never should have been regarded as allies of Alterac. For the prince blamed the Horde for the doom of the kingdom, believing that the orcs had failed to protect Alterac as they had pledged to do. And then there was the Alliance, the so-called sister kingdoms that had descended upon Alterac in their fury and put its people to the torch. That is why those who remained in the mountains, led by Prince Aladin, they began to call the Horde, yes, even Thrall's Horde, and the Alliance, their mortal enemies. They sought only to restore the glory of their former land through whatever means they could. And now, everyone, we arrive to it at last, the shadowy enemy that has followed us through this entire adventure in Hillsbrad Foothills and Alterac Mountains. This was the birth of the Syndicate, one of Classic WoW's lesser-known factions. No doubt while roaming in Hillsbrad Foothills or the Alterac Mountains, you have encountered these orange face mask-wearing stealthed rogues and sorcerers holding on to what little remains of this land. Strombrad is a place of great operation for them, as well as camps all across the Alterac Highlands in the north. And it is there, during Classic WoW, that one can find Aladin Paranold scheming and brooding on ways to reclaim his kingdom, not with honor or valor on a battlefield, but with treachery and cutthroat tactics on the road, or perhaps something far darker. For you see, one of the adventures that we can go on during Classic WoW is a mission to assassinate this aspiring king, and while doing this quest, something can be discovered that likely most players overlooked. Before I tell you this though, I just wanted to say, if you're enjoying the video, please consider hitting the subscribe button, as we are nearing 500,000 subscribers on this YouTube channel. And if you want to show further support, become a channel member and get access to behind the scenes videos, or get yourself a Tales of Warcraft shirt over on our merch store. But now, let's continue. Downstairs from where the would-be king is located is a mysterious orc, and his name is Nagaz. Now, who is this orc? Why is he present with the Alterac prince and his nobles? Well, these answers are not quite so apparent at first. Perhaps he's just a former ally from the original Horde? We're not entirely sure. And we wouldn't know the answer to this question unless we happen to stumble upon a certain encrypted letter held by the Syndicate far to the south of where Nagaz can be found. For it's here at one of the Syndicate camps that a letter can be discovered resting on a table, and upon trying to read it, we would discover that this letter is magically encrypted, its contents unreadable, and a mystery. Now, we would then go on a short but lengthy quest chain, at least in regards to traveling, that would allow us to discover the mystery of what this letter says. And once it's revealed, we learn all about this mysterious orc hiding away with Prince Aladin Paranold. And although I could simply just go over what the letter says, perhaps it might be better for me to just read the letter to you all, and you can tell me if you notice something odd or curious about what is written. This is what the encrypted letter says.
Greetings, Master. Forgive me for the method of sending this message. My shadow mages in Alterac are intent on their tasks, forcing me to use a foreign messenger, conscripted from one of our new allies, to bring you this report. But I have encrypted this letter with one of our most esoteric ciphers. Its words are safe from these yokels. Our plans progress well. As mentioned, we made an alliance with a group of humans who call themselves the Syndicate. Its leaders were once the nobles of Alterac, and they crave to once again hold sway here. And so they have struck a bargain with us. A bargain they will regret. Today, the Syndicate holds little power in these lands, but they know the area well and have assembled sufficient manpower for the tasks ahead. With proper guiding, I am confident that soon the Syndicate will again rule Alterac. In addition, we have urged the Syndicate to aim for the city of Stromgard in the nearby Arathi Highlands. The city is a battlefield between our forces, ogres, and the humans of Stromgard, but we feel that with careful tactics, we will own this once great city. And when that is done, the next stage of our plan may begin. With a nation of our own and a base of power in this region, we may then prepare the way for the third host. Soon, the Legion Lords will reward our works by raining fire from the skies once again. The Council was wise to appoint you head of the Argus Wake, marshal of our strategies in the land of humans and dwarves. And I am honored to serve as the hand of your will in Alterac. In Sargeras' name, Nagaz, Argus Hierophant.
As already mentioned, since Alterac's doom, those who remain have sought to rebuild their former kingdom, to restore it to the glory that it once had before it was felled by the surrounding nations of the Alliance. And in their attempts to restore what was lost, clearly the people of Alterac, their prince included, have turned to darker dealings with a group called the Argus Wake. Now, for many of you, likely you've never heard of this particular organization, and you shouldn't blame yourself for it, for this is, well, admittingly, this is the only quest or mention of the Argus Wake in all of Classic WoW. Everything that we know about them comes from this one letter and this one quest chain, yet it does reveal quite a bit. Clearly, the Argus Wake are involved with the Burning Legion, hence the name, and it is a part of the Legion's scheme for Alterac's remnant to reclaim their kingdom, which the Argus Wake would likely have great hold over, especially considering the presence of how many dark sorcerers are now present in the Syndicate ranks. Clearly, this shadowy organization has been busy with teaching forbidden magic. It's also assumed that the Argus Wake, like the Searing Blade and the Cult of the Darkstrand, is a smaller organization controlled by the Greater Shadow Council. Yes, indeed, the same Shadow Council that operated within the Old Horde during its initial invasion of Azeroth, the same group overseen by Gul'dan, who is called the Darkness Incarnate. Before his death, of course. And this will not be the only time that we encounter the manipulations of the Shadow Council as we travel across Azeroth together. Now, I'm sure that many of you are curious of what happened next with Alterac, as well as the Argus Wake after Classic WoW. And sadly, there isn't really much to say. The Syndicate and the remnants of Alterac have only continued to lose more and more ground since Cataclysm, leading all the way up into the current expansion. Sometimes they appear here and there, but the Syndicate only comes as simple bandits to be disposed of with ease, usually in the Arathi Highlands, rather than former soldiers and militia of a once proud kingdom. And as for the Argus Wake, they themselves never appear again in the lore as an actual organization, but Nagaz makes a reappearance in the Legion expansion as part of the Warlock's Scepter of Sargeras artifact weapon quest chain. Originally, he is presented as an ally to the Warlock player in Legion, assisting him with acquiring the Book of Medivh, until Nagaz betrays the player and attempts to kill him. Now for doing so, of course, Nagaz is killed by the player, and hopefully for good this time, because apparently getting his head cut off in Classic WoW wasn't enough to put an end to this orc's schemes. But I guess he was just soul-stoned. But I don't know. For many, the mountains of Alterac remain an out-of-the-way zone in Classic WoW, rarely visited because so many of its quests require great amounts of traveling. Players need to form groups to defeat the challenges of these hills, and the fact that this zone's story is so concealed and it's not so obvious upon entry. For most, when they adventure into the Alterac Mountains, they see only a ruined kingdom, populated now by ogres and a mysterious orange mask-wearing organization. But I hope that now, having watched this video, you have a better understanding of not only this kingdom's history, but this forgotten enemy, the Syndicate, from Classic World of Warcraft. And like I said in my previous video about the Alterac Mountains, maybe you understand now why going here creates such enchantment for me. Now I still have a video or two left in me about Hillsbrad Foothills and Alterac Mountains, but I do wonder where we should go next. Should we travel north into the haunted woods of the Western Plaguelands, visit the dwarves of the hinterlands, or perhaps head east into the Arathi Highlands to learn more about Stromgarde and its history? Let me know down in the comments section below, and if you want another video to watch after this one, I highly recommend this Silverpine Forest video that I made about one of Classic WoW's most powerful, if not the most powerful, villains. And now I think it's time for me to end this video with a very popular song that is sung all across the taverns of Azeroth about the fall of the Kingdom of Alterac. Thank you so much for watching, everybody.
Seven crowns once shared the land, all bound by oaths of old. They raised their steel with brother zeal, their banners brave and bold. But one king's heart grew black with greed, his honor lost to flame. He sold his trust for coin and dust, and damned his kingdom's name. He forged his pact in moonlit halls, with whispers sharp as knives. He marched his men on former friends and shattered loyal lives. But traitor's steel is brittle stuff, and soon the tide did turn. The six came down like thunder's crown to make his kingdom burn. His castle cracked, his banners torn, his loyalists all fled. And when the smoke had left the stones, the traitor king was dead. Now travelers say his ghost still walks, chained by the oath he broke. A warning sung in every inn beneath Ale's amber smoke.